Before the fire, before the siege, before the tanks and the tear gas, there was only the man. He was a soft-spoken musician with a slight lisp and an encyclopedic, almost supernatural knowledge of scripture. He was a high school dropout, a failed rock star who declared himself a messiah. He taught his followers that the end of the world was not just coming, but that it was welcome, and that he alone held the key to their salvation. His name was Vernon Howell, but the world would come to know him as David Koresh. Tonight, we journey into the heart of closed worlds, communities built on the powerful, dangerous idea that they have found the one true path. These are stories born from a charismatic leader's vision, of followers who surrender their lives to a singular belief, and the tragic, often violent, collision that occurs when their isolated world meets the one outside. It's the quiet hum of a shared faith in a lonely place, the echo of a single voice defining reality for everyone who listens. It's the strange gravity that can pull a family or 100 families away from the world and into a fortress of their own making, a fortress that can become a prison, and sometimes a tomb. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a humbling experience to see how far these stories travel, and how many of us are gathered here in this shared, quiet space. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights, let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Waco siege in the flat, sun-baked plains of central Texas, about 10 miles east of the city of Waco, there stood a collection of buildings that was not quite a town and not quite a home. It was known as the Mount Carmel Center. To a passing car on the dusty farm road, it might have looked like a sprawling, somewhat ramshackle commune, a collection of rough-hewn wooden structures dominated by a large, 3-story central building that was in a constant state of expansion. There was a water tower, some outbuildings, and a scattering of old cars and buses. It was isolated, a world unto itself, set against the vast, empty Texas sky. This was the home of the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians were not a New Age cult born from the counterculture of the 1960s. Their roots ran much deeper, tracing back to a schism within the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 1930s. They were a small, devout, and deeply apocalyptic Christian sect, people who believed they were living in the end times, awaiting the imminent return of Jesus Christ. For decades, they lived a quiet, obscure existence at Mount Carmel, guided by a succession of leaders who claimed the gift of prophecy. But in the late 1980s, a new and uniquely charismatic figure emerged, a man who would transform the small community and set it on a collision course with the full force of the U.S. government. His name was Vernon Howell. Born in Houston in 1959, Howell was a troubled and restless young man. He was dyslexic, a high school dropout, and the product of a difficult, unstable childhood. But he possessed two extraordinary gifts. He was a talented and passionate rock guitarist, and he had a prodigious, almost photographic memory for the Bible. He could quote scripture for hours on end, weaving complex, intricate interpretations that dazzled those who heard him. He joined the Branch Davidians in the early 1980s and quickly fell into a power struggle with the group's then leader, George Roden. The conflict culminated in a bizarre 1987 shootout at Mount Carmel, where Howell and his followers arrived armed, leading to his arrest. Though he was acquitted of attempted murder charges, he had successfully wrested control of the group. By 1990, Vernon Howell had legally changed his name. He was now David Koresh. David for the biblical King David, and Koresh, the Hebrew name for the Persian king Cyrus the Great, a figure prophesied to be a messiah to the Jews. The name change signaled his new status. He was no longer just a prophet. He was the final prophet, the Lamb of God, the only person on earth who could unlock the meaning of the 7 seals from the book of Revelation and bring about the final judgment. Under Koresh, the theology of the Branch Davidians became centered entirely on him. He taught that the world's governments were the beast of Revelation, and that his followers were the saints who would fight in the final apocalyptic battle. His most controversial doctrine was that of the new light. His claim that as the Lamb of God, all the women in the community were his spiritual wives. He systematically dissolved the existing marriages within the group, taking more than a dozen wives for himself, some of whom were as young as 12 or 13 years old. To the men of the community he preached celibacy, promising them wives from their own resurrected ranks in the kingdom to come. To the outside world, this was statutory rape and polygamy. To the followers inside Mount Carmel, it was the divine will of God's chosen messenger. Koresh's control was absolute, a blend of biblical authority, personal charisma, and psychological manipulation. It was not his unorthodox theology, however, that brought him to the attention of federal law enforcement. It was his obsession with the final apocalyptic battle. Koresh taught that this battle would be a literal one, and he began to prepare for it by stockpiling a massive arsenal of weapons. The community's main source of income became buying and selling firearms at gun shows across Texas. They began legally purchasing vast quantities of semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and ammunition. But according to a complaint filed by the local sheriff's office, they were also suspected of illegally modifying rifles to be fully automatic machine guns. This allegation triggered an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF. The ATF, an agency that had been stung by a series of recent scandals and was facing budget cuts, saw the Koresh case as an opportunity for a high-profile victory. They launched an undercover investigation, planting an agent, Robert Rodriguez, who managed to befriend Koresh and gain limited access to the compound. Rodriguez confirmed the presence of a large number of weapons but could not definitively confirm that they were illegal. Despite the ambiguous evidence, the ATF decided to move forward with a large-scale raid to execute a search and arrest warrant. The plan, codenamed Operation Trojan Horse, was for a dynamic entry, a full frontal assault on the compound by nearly 80 heavily armed agents. They planned to overwhelm the Davidians with speed and force. It was a plan that relied entirely on the element of surprise. But the element of surprise was lost before the raid even began. On the morning of Sunday, February 28, 1993, a local television cameraman, who had been tipped off about the impending raid, stopped at a gas station and asked a postal worker for directions to the Roddenville compound. That postal worker happened to be a branch Davidian and was David Koresh's brother-in-law. He immediately raced back to Mount Carmel to warn Koresh that something was coming. The ATF, monitoring communications from inside, heard the news. Koresh knew. Their cover was blown. The undercover agent, Robert Rodriguez, who was inside the compound that morning, was confronted by Koresh. "They're coming, Robert," Koresh said, his demeanor strangely calm. "The ATF is coming." Rodriguez, his cover blown, made an excuse and left, his heart pounding. He pleaded with his superiors over the radio to call off the raid. "They know we're coming. Call it off," he begged. But the ATF commanders made a fateful, catastrophic decision. They believed they had come too far to turn back. The cattle trailers, filled with armed agents in full tactical gear, were already rolling down the dusty road toward the compound. They decided to proceed with the raid. As the trailers pulled up and the agents began to pour out, shouting, "Police! Search warrant!" they were met not by surprised and compliant suspects, but by a fortified community that had been preparing for this very day, this very apocalypse, for years. David Koresh appeared at the front door. He raised his hands, then closed the door. Who fired the first shot remains one of the most bitterly debated questions of the entire siege. The ATF claims they were fired upon from within the compound as they approached the front door. The surviving Davidians claim the ATF fired first, shooting at the dogs and into the building indiscriminately. Whatever the truth, in an instant, the quiet Texas morning exploded into a full-scale firefight. The siege of Waco had begun. The firefight that erupted on the plains of Waco was a brutal, chaotic, and fundamentally unequal affair. The ATF agents, expecting to storm a building and surprise its occupants, were instead caught in the open, exposed on the flat, featureless land surrounding the Mount Carmel compound. The Branch Davidians, firing from the safety of their fortified church, which they had nicknamed the Armory, had superior positions and a clear field of fire. The agents were trapped in a lethal crossfire, with bullets tearing through the thin metal of the cattle trailers they had arrived in. The battle raged for nearly 2 hours, a furious exchange of thousands of rounds. When the shooting finally subsided, after a tense ceasefire was negotiated over the phone, the cost was horrifyingly clear. For ATF agents, Conway Leblew, Todd McKeehan, Robert Williams, and Stephen Willis, lay dead or dying. More than 24 other agents were wounded, some severely. The raid had been an unmitigated disaster, a catastrophic failure of intelligence and execution. On the Davidian side, the cost was also immediate and brutal. 6 branch Davidians were killed in the initial exchange, including Perry Jones, Koresh's father-in-law, and Peter Gent, a young man from Australia. Koresh himself was wounded, shot in his hand and side. But for David Koresh and his followers, the failed raid was not a disaster. It was a divine vindication. For years, he had preached that the forces of Babylon, the U.S. government, would come to destroy them, and now they had. He was not a false prophet. He was the prophet whose prophecies had just come true in the most spectacular way imaginable. The raid, and the deaths of their own, solidified their resolve and cemented Koresh's authority as God's chosen messenger. They were now sealed inside their sanctuary. Martyrs in a holy war they believed they were destined to win. In the aftermath of the botched raid, the ATF was swiftly and humiliatingly sidelined. A new, far more formidable force took command: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI's elite hostage rescue team, HRT, arrived on the scene, and with them came a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. The failed law enforcement action was now a hostage situation. The FBI, however, saw the situation through a completely different lens than the one Koresh and his followers inhabited. They were not dealing with saints in a holy war. They were dealing with a dangerous, manipulative cult leader holding innocent women and children hostage. This fundamental, unbridgeable gap in worldview would define the next 51 days. The perimeter around Mount Carmel transformed into a massive, fortified encampment. The dusty farm roads were now lined with armored vehicles, Bradley fighting vehicles, and M1 Abrams tanks. Snipers were positioned around the compound. The media descended, creating a satellite city of their own, broadcasting the unfolding drama to a captivated and horrified world. The siege had become the biggest news story on the planet. The negotiations began. On one end of the phone line was David Koresh. On the other were the FBI's lead negotiators, most notably Byron Sage. The conversations were a surreal clash of cultures. The FBI wanted to talk about logistics, about the release of hostages, about a peaceful surrender. Koresh wanted to talk about the Bible. He delivered long, rambling, and often brilliant sermons, intricate exegeses of the Book of Revelation, explaining his role as the Lamb of God who alone could open the 7 seals. To the FBI, it was the nonsensical, manipulative babbling of a cult leader. To Koresh, it was the most important message in the history of the world, and he now had a global audience. In the early days of the siege, there were small glimmers of hope. Koresh agreed to release some of the children from the compound. Over several days, a total of 21 children were allowed to walk out, a procession of small figures emerging from the fortress into the arms of federal agents. This was seen as a positive sign by the FBI, a signal that a negotiated, peaceful resolution was possible. But Koresh was operating on his own timetable, one dictated by his interpretation of Scripture, not by the demands of the FBI. As the days turned into weeks, the FBI's patience began to wear thin. The negotiation team, which advocated for a slower, more patient approach, found itself increasingly at odds with the tactical command of the HRT, which saw the standoff as a military problem that required a tactical solution. The FBI began to employ psychological warfare tactics to increase the pressure on those inside. They cut the electricity to the compound. At night, they bombarded the buildings with powerful, glaring spotlights. Most notoriously, they blasted the compound with a bizarre and tormenting soundtrack for hours on end. The high-pitched screams of rabbits being slaughtered, Nancy Sinatra songs, Christmas carols, and Tibetan Buddhist chants. These tactics, designed to disorient and wear down the Davidians, had the opposite effect. They reinforced Koresh's narrative that they were being persecuted by the godless forces of Babylon. Life inside the compound was difficult. Food and water were rationed, and the conditions were Spartan. But their faith and their belief in Koresh was hardening into an unbreakable resolve. The FBI was not dealing with criminals who could be psychologically broken. They were dealing with true believers who were prepared to die for their faith. Koresh, for his part, continued to dangle the prospect of a mass surrender, but always with a catch. At one point, he promised to come out after a sermon of his was broadcast on national radio. The FBI complied, and a station broadcast his hour-long message. Koresh did not surrender. He then claimed that God had told him to wait. The FBI felt they were being played, that Koresh was a master manipulator who had no real intention of ever coming out peacefully. The stalemate dragged on. The FBI was spending over $1 million a week to maintain the massive siege. The political pressure from Washington, particularly from the newly appointed Attorney General Janet Reno, was immense. The image of the United States government being held at bay by a cult leader in Texas was becoming a national embarrassment. A sense of frustration was hardening into a dangerous resolve. The voices arguing for patience were being drowned out by those demanding action. The tactical solution, once a last resort, was beginning to look like the only option left. The long, tense waiting game was coming to an end, and the stage was being set for a final, fiery conclusion. By mid-April, the 51-day siege had reached a breaking point. The FBI's tactical commanders, led by Richard Rogers of the hostage rescue team, had lost all faith in the negotiation process. They saw David Koresh not as a man who could be reasoned with, but as a child abuser and a con man who was simply stalling for time and basking in the global media attention. Their assessment, which they forcefully presented to their superiors in Washington, was that the situation inside the compound was deteriorating. They claimed, with little concrete evidence, that the children inside were being physically abused and were suffering from unsanitary conditions. They argued that Koresh would never surrender peacefully and that a decisive, tactical intervention was necessary to end the standoff and save the lives of the children. This aggressive tactical viewpoint gained traction all the way up the chain of command, landing on the desk of the new U.S. Attorney General, Janet Reno. Reno, who had been in office for just over a month, was now faced with an incredibly difficult decision. She was presented with a scenario where further waiting would only prolong the alleged suffering of the children inside. The FBI proposed a plan. They would not conduct a full-scale assault, but would instead use military-grade hardware to systematically inject tear gas into the compound. The idea was that the gas would create an environment so uncomfortable that it would force the Davidians out of the building and into the arms of waiting agents, without a shot being fired. They assured her that the gas, CS gas, was non-lethal and would not pose a significant risk to the children. Reno was deeply hesitant. She questioned the FBI commanders repeatedly about the risks, particularly the risk of fire. The compound was a wooden tinderbox, and the Davidians were known to have flammable materials like kerosene and propane inside. The commanders assured her that the risk of a fire was minimal and that they had firefighting equipment on standby. After days of deliberation, and reportedly after receiving a direct recommendation from President Bill Clinton to proceed, Janet Reno gave the final authorization. The tear gas assault was approved for the morning of April 19, 1993. The choice of that date was a chilling and likely unintentional piece of historical irony. April 19th held a deep, symbolic meaning in the world of anti-government extremists. It was the anniversary of the first shots of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. It was also the date that, just 1 year prior, federal agents had engaged in a deadly shootout with Randy Weaver and his family at Ruby Ridge, another event that had become a rallying cry for the Patriot movement. For a group of people who believed they were fighting a holy war against a tyrannical government, an attack on this specific date would have been seen as the ultimate fulfillment of prophecy. At dawn on April 19th, the final assault began. The scene was surreal. Two massive, military-grade combat engineering vehicles, CEVs, which were essentially M60 tanks fitted with battering rams and booms, lumbered toward the Mount Carmel compound. They looked like monstrous, prehistoric insects descending on the flimsy wooden structure. Over a loudspeaker, the FBI broadcast a final message. "This is not an assault. We are not entering the compound. We are delivering tear gas." This has been approved by the Attorney General of the United States. Come out now and you will not be harmed. The Davidians did not come out. Instead, they retreated deeper into the building, donning their gas masks. The CEVs began their work with brutal efficiency. They systematically punched holes in the walls of the compound and used long booms to shatter the windows. Through these openings, they began pumping massive quantities of CS gas into the building. For 6 hours, the assault continued. The CVs methodically worked their way around the structure, gassing room after room. The compound was shrouded in a thick, choking cloud. From the FBI's perspective, the plan was failing. They had expected the Davidians to come streaming out within an hour or two, but the hours dragged on and only a handful of people emerged. The Davidians were proving far more resilient than anticipated. Their military-style gas masks were effective, and they retreated to a concrete bunker area in the center of the building where the gas was less concentrated. The FBI's non-lethal, humanitarian solution was not working. Then, at 12:07 p.m., a small flicker of flame was seen in a window on the second floor. What happened next is the most debated and most tragic moment of the entire siege. Within minutes, the small flame exploded. A fierce, powerful wind was blowing across the Texas plains that day, and it whipped the fire into an inferno with terrifying speed. The dry, wooden structure, soaked in flammable gas and filled with hay bales for insulation, went up like a torch. Black smoke poured from the windows, and the entire building was engulfed in a raging firestorm. The FBI claimed the Davidians had committed mass suicide, deliberately setting the fire themselves in a final, apocalyptic act of self-destruction. They pointed to infrared surveillance footage from an aircraft flying overhead, which they claimed showed flashes of light inside the building just before the fire erupted, suggesting Davidians were igniting the flames at multiple points simultaneously. They also cited audio surveillance that they said captured chilling phrases from inside, like, "The fuel has to go on," and "light the fire." The surviving Davidians and a host of outside critics told a different story. They argued that the fire was started accidentally by the actions of the FBI. They claimed that the tear gas canisters, which are pyrotechnic and burn at high temperatures, could have easily ignited the hay or other flammable materials inside. They also argued that the CEVs, by smashing into the building, could have overturned kerosene lanterns or damaged electrical wiring, sparking the blaze. Most damningly, they pointed out that the CEVs continued to punch holes in the building even after the fire had started, which they argued created a chimney effect that fanned the flames and made escape impossible. They contended that the FBI's actions had not just been a failed rescue attempt, but a de facto death sentence. The firefighting equipment that Janet Reno had been assured was on standby was nowhere near the building. Fire trucks were kept blocks away and were not brought in until the compound had already burned to the ground. The FBI's rationale was that they feared their firefighters would be shot at by the Davidians. As the world watched on live television, the Mount Carmel Center was consumed by fire, collapsing in on itself in a pillar of black smoke. The 51-day siege was over. The Holy War had reached its apocalyptic conclusion. The fire that consumed the Mount Carmel Center on April 19, 1993, burned with a terrible, cleansing totality. When the embers finally cooled and investigators were able to sift through the charred, smoking ruins, the full human cost of the 51-day siege was revealed, and it was staggering. 76 people inside the compound had died, including more than 20 children, some as young as 2 years old. David Koresh himself was found dead from a single gunshot wound to the head, a wound that was determined to be self-inflicted or the result of a mercy killing by a trusted follower. Only 9 people managed to escape the inferno. Combined with the 4 ATF agents and 6 Davidians killed in the initial raid, the total death toll from the Waco tragedy was 86. In the immediate aftermath, the official narrative promoted by the FBI and the Clinton administration was one of mass suicide. Attorney General Janet Reno, in a now-famous press conference, took full responsibility for the decision to launch the tear gas assault, but she staunchly defended the actions of the FBI. They were a cult that was armed to the teeth, that had murdered 4 federal agents, she stated. The prevailing story was that a benevolent government had done its best to end a hostage situation peacefully, but had been thwarted by a mad, suicidal cult leader who chose to kill his followers rather than surrender. This narrative, however, began to crumble almost immediately under the weight of public scrutiny and independent investigation. The questions surrounding the siege were numerous and deeply troubling. Why was a dynamic military-style raid chosen over a simpler knock-and-talk approach to serve the warrant? Why did the ATF proceed with the raid even after they knew the element of surprise was lost? Who truly fired the first shot? And most critically, what or who started the final catastrophic fire? The debate over the fire's origin became the central, most contentious point of the entire tragedy. The government's claim of mass suicide was challenged by evidence suggesting the FBI's own actions may have been responsible. The use of highly flammable CS gas, the continued demolition of the building by the CEVs as it burned, and the decision to keep fire trucks away from the scene were all seen as, at best, gross negligence and at worst, a deliberate action that sealed the fate of those inside. The controversy was further fueled in 1999 when a documentary filmmaker uncovered evidence that the FBI had used pyrotechnic M651 tear gas rounds, which burn at nearly 400 degrees Celsius and carry an explicit fire warning. Despite having denied using such devices for years, the legal fallout from Waco was long and complex. 11 surviving Branch Davidians were put on trial in 1994, charged with conspiracy to murder federal agents. In a split verdict that reflected the public's ambiguity about the case, the jury acquitted them of the murder conspiracy charges but found several guilty on lesser charges, like voluntary manslaughter and weapons violations. Their sentences, some as long as 40 years, were seen by many as excessively harsh, further fueling the narrative of a vindictive government. Congressional hearings were held, and an independent investigation was commissioned, led by former Senator John Danforth. These official inquiries largely exonerated the federal agencies of any deliberate wrongdoing, concluding that the Davidians themselves had set the fire. But these findings did little to quell the public's deep-seated distrust. For millions of Americans, Waco was not a law enforcement action gone wrong. It was a symbol of government overreach and deadly incompetence, an American tragedy where the lines between hero and villain, victim and perpetrator, were hopelessly blurred. The legacy of the Waco siege is profound and has echoed through American history in dark and powerful ways. For the burgeoning anti-government militia movement of the 1990s, Waco became a sacred touchstone, a martyr's tale. It was seen as irrefutable proof that the federal government was a tyrannical force, willing to slaughter its own citizens, including women and children, for exercising their right to bear arms and practice their religion. The image of the burning compound became a powerful recruiting tool for extremist groups across the country. The most direct and devastating consequence of this legacy came exactly 2 years to the day after the fire. On April 19, 1995, a young anti-government extremist named Timothy McVeigh, who had traveled to Waco during the siege to witness it firsthand, parked a truck bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The resulting explosion killed 168 people. McVeigh chose that date deliberately. His act of mass murder was, in his mind, a direct act of retribution for what he saw as the government's massacre at Waco. The fire that had consumed Mount Carmel had, 2 years later, ignited an even greater one in the heart of the nation. For federal law enforcement, Waco became a crucible from which hard and painful lessons were learned. The disastrous raid and the subsequent siege led to significant changes in policy and training for standoffs and hostage situations. There is now a far greater emphasis on patience, on de-escalation, and on understanding the psychology of the groups involved, particularly those with apocalyptic beliefs. The memory of Waco has served as a permanent cautionary brake on the impulse for swift, tactical solutions, a lesson written in the blood of both federal agents and the men, women, and children of the Branch Davidian sect. Today, on the site where the Mount Carmel Center once stood, a small new chapel has been built. It is a quiet, humble place, a memorial to those who died there. The story of Waco remains a deeply divisive and sorrowful chapter in American history, a tragedy born from a perfect storm of religious fanaticism, institutional arrogance, and a catastrophic failure of communication. It is a haunting reminder of the danger that lies at the intersection of faith, fear, and firepower, and of the terrible human cost of a prophecy fulfilled. The Rajneeshi bioterror attack in the high desert of central Oregon. There is a vast, empty stretch of land known as the Big Muddy Ranch. It is a place of scrub brush, canyons, and boundless sky, a landscape defined by its rugged isolation and a silence that feels ancient. For decades, it was little more than a sprawling, 64,000-acre cattle ranch, a place of hard work and solitude. But in the summer of 1981, this remote corner of Wasco County became the stage for one of the most audacious and bizarre social experiments in American history. An experiment that began as a utopian dream and ended as a criminal conspiracy, culminating in the first and largest bioterrorist attack on U.S. soil. The architects of this dream were a study in contrasts. The spiritual center was a man known to the world as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He was an Indian mystic, a former philosophy professor turned guru, an enigmatic figure with a flowing gray beard, soft, hypnotic eyes, and a quiet, mesmerizing voice. His philosophy was a potent, custom-made cocktail for the spiritually searching Westerner. A blend of Eastern mysticism, Western pop, psychology, human potential movement ideas, and a radical embrace of materialism and sexual freedom. He taught that enlightenment was not to be found through self-denial, but through joyful indulgence. He railed against organized religion, traditional morality, and the family unit, all while positioning himself as the ultimate spiritual master. His signature technique was dynamic meditation, a cathartic, chaotic practice of screaming, shouting, and frenzied movement designed to shatter the ego and liberate the soul. By the late 1970s, his ashram in Pune, India, had become a global destination for thousands of followers, who called themselves sannyasins. They were, for the most part, educated, affluent Westerners, doctors, lawyers, therapists, who donned the signature red and orange clothing of the movement, wore a mala bead necklace with a locket containing his picture, and surrendered their lives to his vision. But as the movement grew, so did the controversy and the pressure from the Indian government. The Bhagwan needed a new home for his flock, a new laboratory for his vision of the new man. This is where the second key figure emerged, Ma Anand Sheela. Sheela was not a mystic. She was a force of nature, a young, sharp-tongued, and ferociously intelligent Indian woman. She had become the Bhagwan's personal secretary and the organizational mastermind of the entire Rajneesh movement, while the Bhagwan floated on a cloud of spiritual discourse and, by 1981, a self-imposed public vow of silence. Sheela was the one who handled the money, the logistics, and the unfiltered, often brutal reality of building an empire. She was pragmatic, profane, and utterly devoted to her master. It was Sheela who orchestrated the purchase of the Big Muddy Ranch for nearly $6 million, using funds from the movement's vast international network of communes and businesses. The vision was breathtaking in its ambition: to build a self-sustaining utopian city from scratch in the middle of the Oregon desert. It would be a city for 50,000 people with its own farms, its own airport, its own power grid, its own schools, and its own laws. It would be called Rajneeshpuram. In the summer of 1981, the sannyasins began to arrive. Thousands of them, clad in their trademark red, descended upon the dusty ranch. They were an army of true believers, and their capacity for work was staggering. With remarkable speed and efficiency, they began to transform the barren landscape. They built roads, laid power lines, constructed A-frame houses, and planted vast agricultural fields. A massive meeting hall, capable of holding thousands, rose from the desert floor. They erected a shopping mall, a pizzeria, a hotel, and a casino. The Bhagwan himself resided in a secluded compound, beginning a collection of Rolls-Royce automobiles that would eventually number over 90, a fleet of luxury cars that stood as a spectacular, two-fingered salute to a world that equated piety with poverty. For the sannyasins, this was the dawn of a new age, the physical manifestation of their spiritual journey. But for the original inhabitants of the area, it was an invasion. The nearest town to the Big Muddy Ranch was Antelope, Oregon, population at the time, 40 people. Antelope was a tiny, sleepy enclave of retirees and ranchers, a deeply conservative, church-going community where time seemed to move at a different pace. Suddenly, on their doorstep, was a city of thousands of red-clad cultists who practiced free love. worshipped a silent guru in a Rolls-Royce, and seemed to have an endless supply of money. The culture clash was immediate and profound. The locals saw the Rajneeshis as a dangerous, immoral cult. The Rajneeshis saw the locals as ignorant, intolerant bigots standing in the way of their enlightened utopia. The initial friction centered on land use. The sannyasins were building a city, a clear violation of county zoning laws which designated the area for agricultural use. Legal battles erupted almost immediately. The Rajneeshis argued for religious freedom, claiming Rajneeshpuram was not a city but an intentional community. The state of Oregon and a local watchdog group called 1000 Friends of Oregon fought them at every turn, determined to stop the illegal city from taking permanent root. It was this legal and political opposition that began the slow, toxic transformation of the Rajneeshi dream. Ma Anand Sheela, in particular, saw the local and state government not as a body to be negotiated with, but as an enemy to be conquered. Her rhetoric, broadcast in news interviews, became increasingly combative and belligerent. "We are not here to be a tourist attraction for you bigots," she snapped at one town meeting. "We are going to be here forever." Faced with legal obstacles, Sheela decided on a new, more aggressive strategy: a political takeover. If the laws of Wasco County were a problem, they would simply change the lawmakers. The first target was the tiny town next door. In 1982, the Rajneeshis began buying up property in Antelope, and then, using their overwhelming numbers, they voted to take control of the city council. In a final act of conquest, they officially changed the name of the town from Antelope to Rajneesh. The original residents were horrified. They were now strangers in their own home, governed by people they considered to be part of a hostile, invading force. But taking over a town of 40 people was small time. The real power lay at the county level with the Wasco County Court. And Sheela had a plan for that, too. She saw that the upcoming county election in November 1984 was the key. If she could win 2 of the 3 seats on the county court, she could gain control of the zoning and land use decisions that threatened the very existence of Rajneeshpuram. The utopian experiment was about to enter a dark new phase, one in which the quest for enlightenment would be abandoned in favor of a ruthless, bare-knuckle quest for political power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push the community from a spiritual haven into a criminal enterprise. Ma Anand Sheela's plan to seize political control of Wasco County was, in its initial conception, a straightforward exercise in democratic brute force. The Rajneeshis had the numbers. If they could get their followers registered to vote in the county, they could easily outvote the local population and install their own candidates on the county court. The problem was residency. Oregon law required a person to be a resident for at least 20 days before an election to be eligible to vote. With the election of November 1984 fast approaching, Sheela needed a way to get thousands of her sannyasins officially registered as Wasco County residents. Her first gambit was a massive voter registration drive within the commune. Sannyasins lined up to fill out voter cards, claiming Rajneeshpuram as their legal residence. But the Wasco County clerk, a shrewd and suspicious woman named Sue Prostar, saw the move for what it was: an attempt by a transient, non-resident population to hijack the local election. She began challenging the registrations, demanding individual residency hearings for every single sannyasin who had registered, a bureaucratic move that would effectively delay their voting rights past the election date. Frustrated by this legal roadblock, Sheela escalated her tactics. If she couldn't register the voters she already had, she would simply import new ones. In the late summer of 1984, she launched a program she euphemistically called the Share a Home program. The Rajneeshis put out a national call, offering free food, shelter, and a new life to the nation's homeless population. Busing operations were set up in major cities across the country, and soon, thousands of homeless individuals, men and women suffering from addiction, mental illness, and poverty, were being transported by the busload to the high desert of Oregon. The program was pitched as a humanitarian gesture, a testament to the Rajneeshis' compassionate ethos, but its true purpose was cynical and political. The goal was to register these thousands of new arrivals as voters before the November deadline. The reality on the ranch was a disaster. The homeless were housed in makeshift tents, segregated from the main Sannyasin population. They were not integrated into the community. They were a political tool, a voting bloc to be managed. Fights broke out, the atmosphere grew tense, and the Sannyasins soon realized they could not control the chaotic population they had imported. When it became clear that the new arrivals were too unruly to be reliably herded to the polls, the Share a Home program was abruptly terminated. The homeless were unceremoniously put back on buses and dumped in nearby towns, their brief, strange journey into utopia over. Some were allegedly given a sedative-laced beer for the ride home. With the election just weeks away and her political strategies failing, Sheila and her inner circle of commune leaders grew desperate. They were convinced that the bigots of Waco County were conspiring to destroy them. If they could not win the election through legal or even quasi-legal means, they would win it through another method. They needed to ensure that the legitimate voters of Waco County, the ones who would undoubtedly vote against the Rajneeshi candidates, would be unable to make it to the polls on election day. It was out of this desperation that a dark and unprecedented idea was born. Inside a secret, isolated laboratory at a medical clinic on the ranch, a team of sannyasins led by a trusted nurse named Ma Anand Puja began to cultivate a biological weapon. The weapon they chose was not exotic or difficult to obtain. It was Salmonella typhimurium, a common but potent strain of bacteria that causes severe food poisoning. The plan was as simple as it was diabolical. They would sicken the voting population of the county's largest city, the Dallas, which was the seat of the county government and the heart of the opposition to the commune. If enough people were incapacitated by severe gastrointestinal illness on election day, they would be unable to vote, and the Rajneeshi candidates would win by default. Before launching the full-scale attack, they decided to conduct a series of secret test runs. They needed to see how effective their homegrown bacteria was and how to best deploy it. In late August and early September 1984, Sheila's operatives began their work. They drove to the Dallas and began to discreetly contaminate public spaces. They sprinkled a brownish liquid containing the salmonella, a substance they referred to as salsa, on to produce in the salad bars of local restaurants. They put it on doorknobs at the county courthouse and other public buildings. The first test subjects were 2 Waco County commissioners who were visiting Rajneeshpuram on a fact-finding mission. The sannyasins served them water that had been secretly laced with the salmonella bacteria. Both men became violently ill within a day, suffering from severe diarrhea, vomiting, and fever. The test was a success. Emboldened, they widened their experiment. They targeted a rest home, grocery stores, and any place where they could contaminate food or surfaces without being detected. The results were immediate and devastating. A wave of mysterious, severe food poisoning began to sweep through the Dallas. People were getting sick, but no one could figure out why. Public health officials were baffled. They initially suspected a contaminated water supply or a problem at a single restaurant. They couldn't identify a common source. The largest and most brazen attack occurred over a 2-week period in late September. Operatives from the ranch systematically targeted the salad bars of 10 different restaurants in the Dallas. Salad bars were the perfect delivery mechanism. They were open, accessible, and the mix of ingredients would easily mask the contaminant. They used small, concealed spray bottles and vials to drizzle the salmonella salsa over the lettuce, the cucumbers, the croutons. The effect was catastrophic. A massive outbreak of salmonella poisoning erupted. In total, 751 people fell violently ill. The local hospital was overwhelmed. 45 people had to be hospitalized, some in critical condition. Victims ranged from infants to the elderly. It was, and still is, the single largest bioterrorist attack in the history of the United States. And at the time, no one knew it was an attack. The Oregon Public Health Division launched a massive investigation, but they, too, were unable to pinpoint a single source. The idea that a group would be deliberately poisoning their neighbors was so unthinkable, so outside the realm of normal criminal behavior, that it wasn't even considered as a possibility. For Sheila and her inner circle, the attack was a stunning success. They had proven they could sicken an entire population, that they had the power to incapacitate a city. Their homegrown biological weapon worked. The final stage of their plan was set. They would wait until the weekend before the November election and unleash their salmonella salsa on the Dallas one more time, on a scale that would guarantee their political victory. The city that had stood in their way would be brought to its knees by an invisible enemy, cultivated in a utopian laboratory in the desert. As the November 1984 election approached, the atmosphere at Rajneeshpuram had been irrevocably altered. The initial joyful energy of building a utopia had curdled into a kind of paranoid siege mentality. The commune had become a fortress, not just against the perceived bigotry of the outside world, but against internal dissent as well. Ma Anand Sheila and her inner circle, who referred to themselves as the Mamas, now ruled with an iron fist. The sannyasins' mail was censored, their phone calls were monitored, and their movements were restricted. A heavily armed internal police force, known as the Peace Force, patrolled the ranch, decked out in military-style uniforms. The dream of liberation had devolved into a state of authoritarian control. At the center of this world, yet strangely detached from it, was the Bhagwan himself. Since his arrival in Oregon, he had maintained his public vow of silence, communicating only with Sheila. He spent his days in seclusion, emerging only for his now famous daily drive-by. A slow procession along the main road of the commune in one of his 93 Rolls-Royces, as his red-clad followers lined the street, bowing and chanting in ecstatic reverence. Whether he was aware of the criminal conspiracy being hatched by his most trusted lieutenant is one of the great, unanswered questions of the saga. Sheila would later claim he knew everything. His remaining followers would insist he was a spiritual man, completely aloof from the worldly and criminal affairs of the commune's management. As Sheila and her team prepared to launch their final, decisive bioterror attack on the Dallas just before the election, an unexpected event occurred. The Bhagwan, for reasons that remain unclear, suddenly broke his nearly 4-year vow of silence. In a series of public discourses, he began to speak again, reasserting his direct spiritual authority over the community. This move fundamentally shifted the power dynamic at the ranch. Sheila's absolute control, which had been predicated on her role as his sole interpreter, was now threatened. Sensing her power waning and perhaps fearing exposure, Sheila made a sudden, dramatic move. In mid-September 1985, nearly a year after the poisoning attacks, she and a small group of her most loyal inner circle members abruptly abandoned the commune. They fled to Europe, taking with them millions of dollars from the Rajneeshi corporate accounts. The departure of the commune's iron-fisted ruler left a power vacuum and a state of complete confusion at the ranch. It was into this chaos that the Bhagwan stepped. On September 16, 1985, he called a press conference, a rare and stunning event. He sat before the world's media and, in his soft, hypnotic voice, unleashed a torrent of shocking accusations against the woman who had been his most devoted disciple. He accused Ma Anand Sheila and her gang of fascists of a litany of heinous crimes. He claimed they had committed arson, wiretapped rooms throughout the commune, including his own, and had attempted to poison several public officials and members of his own staff. And then came the bombshell. He revealed that Sheila's group had been responsible for the mass salmonella poisonings in the Dallas the previous year. He announced that he had invited state and federal law enforcement to come to the ranch to investigate. The Bhagwan had, in a single stunning act of self-preservation, turned on his own people and exposed the entire criminal conspiracy. He portrayed himself as a victim, an innocent spiritual leader who had been betrayed and manipulated by a power-hungry subordinate. The revelation sent shockwaves across Oregon and the nation. Law enforcement, who had been stonewalled and legally obstructed for years, now had an open invitation to enter the secretive world of Rajneeshpuram. A massive investigation was launched, led by the Oregon State Police and the FBI. As they descended on the ranch, they were met not with hostility, but with cooperation from the remaining sannyasins, who were reeling from their leaders' accusations. What the investigators found was a treasure trove of evidence that confirmed the Bhagwan's claims and revealed a criminal enterprise even more extensive than he had let on. They discovered the secret laboratory where the salmonella had been cultivated. They found vials of the bacteria still stored in refrigerators. They unearthed a sophisticated, large-scale wiretapping operation that targeted not only rooms within the commune, but also the homes of perceived enemies outside. They found records detailing a plot to assassinate Charles Turner, the U.S. Attorney for Oregon, who had been leading the federal investigation against them. They also found evidence that Sheila's group had plotted to murder the Bhagwan's personal physician, believing he was slowly poisoning their master. The scale of the planned violence was shocking. Investigators discovered invoices for hundreds of handguns and rifles, as well as secret training manuals for assassination and urban warfare. They uncovered a plot, which was never carried out, to fly a bomb-laden plane into the county courthouse in the Dalles. The utopian dream of Rajneeshpuram had concealed a dark and violent reality. Sheila's inner circle had not just been planning to win an election. They had been preparing for an all-out war. With the evidence mounting, the legal system moved swiftly. In October 1985, Ma Anand Sheila and several members of her inner circle were arrested in West Germany. At the same time, the U.S. government was closing in on the Bhagwan himself. While he had publicly exposed the crimes, federal investigators believed he was not an innocent victim. They charged him with immigration fraud, alleging that he had conspired to arrange hundreds of sham marriages between his American followers and foreign sannyasins to illegally obtain green cards for them. Fearing arrest, the Bhagwan decided to flee. On October 27, 1985, he and a small entourage boarded a private Learjet at the Rajneeshpuram airstrip, intending to fly to Bermuda to escape prosecution. But federal authorities had been monitoring his movements. When his plane landed to refuel in Charlotte, North Carolina, it was swarmed by federal agents. The guru in the Rolls-Royce, the enlightened master who had commanded the devotion of thousands, was arrested like a common fugitive on an airport tarmac. He was taken into custody, charged with 35 counts of immigration violations. The spectacular, 4-year saga of Rajneeshpuram was rapidly approaching its final, ignominious end. The arrest of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh marked the definitive end of the Oregon experiment. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy and deeply embarrassing trial, the guru, ever the pragmatist, opted for a deal. In November 1985, he pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of immigration fraud. He was given a 10-year suspended sentence, a $400,000 fine, and, most critically, he agreed to be deported from the United States. He was barred from re-entering the country for 5 years without the permission of the Attorney General. The man who had vowed his community would be in Oregon forever was unceremoniously put on a plane and flown out of the country, beginning a global odyssey as he was denied entry by 21 different nations before finally returning to his original ashram in Pune, India. His departure triggered a mass exodus from the high desert. Rajneeshpuram, the utopian city that had risen so spectacularly from the dust, collapsed just as quickly. The sannyasins, their leader gone and their community bankrupt and disgraced, scattered to the winds. The ranch was sold at auction. The red clothing was abandoned, the malice were put away, and the brief, strange chapter of the Rajneeshis in Oregon was over. The city sign on the road to the former Antelope was taken down, and the town officially reclaimed its original name, a small but powerful symbol of the local community's victory. Meanwhile, the wheels of justice turned for Ma Anand Sheila and her co-conspirators. Extradited from West Germany, Sheila faced a mountain of charges. In a plea bargain of her own, she pleaded guilty to charges of attempted murder, assault, arson, wiretapping, and immigration fraud. She also pleaded guilty to her role in the salmonella poisonings, the first person ever to be convicted for a bioterrorist act on American soil. In 1986, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. However, she served just 29 months of her sentence before being released on parole for good behavior. She was deported and eventually settled in Switzerland, where she went on to run a care facility for the elderly, a surreal epilogue to her time as the militant leader of a desert cult. The legacy of the Rajneeshi saga is a complex and cautionary one. On one level, it is a classic story of a charismatic cult, a tale of how a single, powerful personality can command the absolute devotion of thousands, leading them to abandon their former lives, their families, and ultimately, their own moral compasses. The Bhagwan, who rebranded himself as Osho before his death in 1990, remains a deeply polarizing figure. To his followers, he is still a profound spiritual master, an enlightened being whose teachings on meditation and love continue to inspire millions around the world. To his critics, he was a brilliant charlatan, a master manipulator who used spirituality as a cover for a vast criminal enterprise built on greed, power, and the exploitation of his followers. On another level, the story of the Rajneeshis is a uniquely American story about the clash between utopian ideals and established communities, a conflict over land, culture, and the very definition of freedom. The residents of Waco County saw themselves as defending their way of life from an invasive, alien force. The Rajneeshis saw themselves as pioneers, building a new world and facing persecution for their beliefs. Not unlike the Pilgrims or the Mormons before them, the conflict escalated into a holy war of lawsuits, political maneuvering, and ultimately, criminal conspiracy, a dramatic illustration of how quickly the lines between us and them can harden into a battlefront. But the most significant and chilling legacy of the Rajneeshi affair is its status as a dark harbinger of a new kind of threat. The 1984 Salmonella attack was a watershed moment in the history of terrorism. It demonstrated, for the first time on American soil, that a non-state group could successfully cultivate and deploy a biological weapon to attack a civilian population for political ends. The plot was amateurish in its execution, and the weapon was relatively unsophisticated, but it was horrifyingly effective. It exposed a profound vulnerability that law enforcement had never before seriously considered. In the pre-9/11 world, the Rajneeshi bioterror attack was largely treated as a bizarre, anomalous event, the strange footnote to a wild cult story. It did not trigger a massive overhaul of public health security or a national conversation about the threat of bioterrorism. It was seen as a one-off, the product of a uniquely strange set of circumstances. But in the decades that followed, with the rise of global terrorism and events like the 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway by the Aum Shinrikyo cult, the Rajneeshi case has been re-examined in a much darker light. It stands as a terrifying proof of concept, a blueprint for how easily biological agents can be weaponized. The story of the red-clad followers sprinkling salsa on salad bars in Oregon is no longer just a weird piece of history. It is a vital and sobering case study in the evolution of modern terrorism, a reminder that the most dangerous threats can sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places, not from a foreign enemy, but from a utopian dream gone horribly wrong in the quiet of the American desert. The Atlanta child murders in the late 1970s, Atlanta, Georgia, was a city suffused with a powerful sense of becoming. It was the undisputed capital of the New South, a hub of black political and economic power that had branded itself as the city too busy to hate. Under the leadership of its first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, Atlanta projected an image of progress, optimism, and racial harmony that stood in stark contrast to the turbulent history of the region. It was a city on the rise, its downtown skyline growing, its influence spreading, a testament to what a modern southern metropolis could be. But beneath this gleaming surface of progress, a current of darkness was beginning to stir, a terror that would target the city's most vulnerable and shatter its carefully constructed image, plunging Atlanta into a 2-year nightmare of fear and grief. The nightmare began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the summer of 1979. It did not begin in the affluent, manicured neighborhoods of Buckhead, but in the poor, predominantly black communities on the city's south and west sides. In July, 2 14-year-old boys, Edward Hope Smith and Alfred Evans, vanished within 4 days of each other. Their disappearances, at first, did not set off citywide alarm bells. They were teenagers from struggling neighborhoods, and the initial police assumption was that they were likely runaways, perhaps caught up in the minor troubles that often plagued boys their age. It was a tragic but, in the eyes of the authorities, not an entirely unfamiliar story. On July 28th, the body of Edward Hope Smith was found in a wooded, vacant lot. He had been shot in the back with a .22 caliber pistol. For days later, the body of Alfred Evans was discovered nearby, in the overgrown weeds under a viaduct. He had been strangled. The proximity of the bodies and the timing of their disappearances were noted, but the different methods of murder led police to treat them as two separate, unrelated homicides. There was no sense yet of a pattern, no premonition of the storm that was about to break. The storm arrived in September with the disappearance of another 14-year-old, Milton Harvey. He was last seen riding his bicycle on his way to a bank to run an errand for his mother. A week later, his bicycle was found abandoned. It would be 2 months before his body was discovered, discarded in a remote, wooded area. He, too, had been killed, though the cause was undetermined due to decomposition. Then, on October 21st, the nature of the crisis shifted irrevocably. 9-year-old Yusuf Bell vanished on his way to a neighborhood store to buy snuff for an elderly neighbor. He was a bright, well-liked boy, not a teenager who might be mistaken for a runaway. His disappearance struck a new and terrifying chord in the community. This was a child, snatched in broad daylight from a familiar street. The search for Yusuf was frantic and all-consuming for his family and neighbors. 2 weeks later, his small, clothed body was found by a maintenance worker in the abandoned cafeteria of the dilapidated E.P. Johnson Elementary School. He had been strangled. With the murder of Yusuf Bell, the fear in Atlanta's black communities began to coalesce into a shared, spoken terror. This was no longer a series of isolated tragedies. A pattern was emerging, one that was too horrifying to ignore. Someone was targeting their children. And worse, there was a growing feeling that the police and the city's political establishment were not taking the threat seriously enough. The victims were poor and black, and their cases, the community felt, were not receiving the same level of urgency and resources that would have been afforded to a missing child from the city's wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. The body count continued to rise with chilling regularity. In March of 1980, the nightmare took on a new dimension with the disappearance of 12-year-old Angel Lanier. She was last seen leaving her home, and her body was found 6 days later, tied to a tree in a vacant lot. She was wearing the clothes she had disappeared in, but she had been strangled, and a pair of white underwear that did not belong to her had been stuffed into her mouth. She was the first female victim. The monster, it seemed, was not just killing boys. It was killing children. The city's official response was still muted, but the community's was not. Frustrated and terrified, parents began to organize. They formed their own patrol, groups watching over school bus stops and walking their children home. They held prayer vigils and community meetings, demanding action from a city government they felt had abandoned them. A sense of siege took hold. A green ribbon became the symbol of remembrance for the missing and murdered children. A small, hopeful gesture against a tide of overwhelming darkness. The ribbons began to appear everywhere, tied to trees, to car antennas, to front porch railings. A silent, city-wide testament to a community's shared grief and growing anger. By the summer of 1980, a full year after the first 2 boys had vanished, the crisis had become too big for the city to ignore. The term, the Atlanta child murders, was now a national headline. The official list of victims kept growing, with a new child disappearing or being found dead nearly every month. Mayor Maynard Jackson, under immense pressure, was forced to act. He requested federal assistance, and the FBI, though initially hesitant to get involved in what they saw as a local matter, eventually joined the investigation. A special task force was created, a joint effort between the Atlanta Police Department, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. They set up a headquarters downtown and began the massive, daunting task of trying to connect the dots between more than a dozen different murders. They were hunting for a serial killer, a phantom who was moving with impunity through the city, leaving a trail of dead children in his wake. The task force began to build a profile of their unsub. They believed he was likely a black male, someone who could move through the victims' neighborhoods without arousing suspicion, someone who knew the city's hidden spaces, its wooded lots, its abandoned buildings, its winding rivers, the places where a body could be left unseen. The city of Atlanta, once a beacon of the New South, was now a city under siege, haunted by an invisible enemy who was stealing its children, and with them, its sense of hope. The hunt was on. As the investigation intensified through the fall of 1980 and into the winter of 1981, the killer's pattern, which had been frighteningly consistent, began to change. The bodies of the victims were no longer being left in wooded lots or abandoned buildings around the city. Instead, They began to appear in the rivers that snaked through the Atlanta metropolitan area, primarily the Chattahoochee and the South River. This shift was a critical development for the task force. It was a mistake by the killer, a change in behavior that, for the first time, offered investigators a potential choke point. If the killer was using the rivers to dispose of his victims, then the bridges that crossed those rivers were the key. He had to be using one of them. The task force, now armed with this new theory, compiled a list of every bridge that crossed the Chattahoochee and other local waterways. There were dozens. They couldn't watch all of them. They had to narrow the focus. They began a painstaking analysis, cross-referencing the locations where the bodies were found with the likely points of entry. They consulted with hydrologists from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to map the river currents, trying to predict where a body dropped from a specific bridge would likely end up. This forensic geography, combined with the killer's apparent preference for dumping bodies at night, allowed them to zero in on a handful of high-probability locations. A plan was hatched. They would stake out the bridges. It was a massive undertaking. Dozens of officers, a mix of local police and FBI agents, were assigned to the surveillance detail. For weeks, they sat in unmarked cars, in the bushes, under the cover of darkness, enduring the boredom and the elements, watching and waiting. They monitored bridge after bridge, night after night, with no results. The killer remained a ghost. The body count continued to climb. The pressure on the task force, from the city government, from the terrified public, and from the grieving families, was becoming almost unbearable. Then, in late May 1981, they got a break. Based on the recent discovery of two victims, 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne and 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, whose cases were now officially linked to the child murders, expanding the victim profile to include young adults. The task force focused its attention on a specific bridge. It was the James Jackson Parkway Bridge, which crossed the Chattahoochee River on the city's northwest side. It was a relatively isolated spot, dark and quiet at night, a perfect place for someone to dispose of something unseen. On the night of May 21, 1981, a four-man surveillance team was stationed at the bridge. Two FBI agents were positioned in a hidden observation post on the south bank of the river, while two Atlanta police recruits were in an unmarked car on the north bank. The hours ticked by in the pre-dawn darkness. The night was quiet, the road mostly deserted. Then, at approximately 2:50 a.m. on the morning of May 22nd, the team on the north bank heard a sound that made their hearts stop. It was a loud, distinct splash in the river below the bridge. It was a heavy, resonant sound, not the splash of a small animal or a piece of trash. It sounded like something substantial had been thrown from the bridge into the water. Immediately, the officers sprang into action. They switched on their headlights and sped toward the bridge. As they did, they saw a white 1970 Chevrolet station wagon slowly driving across from the opposite side. It was the only car on the bridge. The officers radioed their FBI counterparts on the south bank to stop the vehicle. The FBI agents pulled out and intercepted the station wagon as it came off the bridge. The driver was a 23-year-old African-American man. He was cooperative but seemed nervous. He identified himself as Wayne Williams. He told the agents that he was a freelance photographer and music promoter, and that he had been on his way to check on an address for a young singer he was scheduled to audition the next morning. He claimed he had just been driving across the bridge when they stopped him. When they asked him about the splash, he denied throwing anything into the river. He said he had simply been getting rid of some trash. The agents let him go, but not before getting his name, his address, and a description of his vehicle. They knew they had something. The timing was too perfect, the coincidence too great. The splash, the lone car on the bridge in the middle of the night. It was the first solid, tangible lead they had in the entire 2-year investigation. Their suspicions were tragically confirmed 2 days later. On May 24th, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater was pulled from the Chattahoochee River, about a mile downstream from the Jackson Parkway Bridge. He was the man the task force now believed Wayne Williams had thrown into the river just 2 nights earlier. With the discovery of Cater's body, Wayne Williams instantly became the prime suspect, the central focus of the entire investigation. The task force descended on his life, meticulously dissecting his background, his movements, and his habits. He was an only child who lived with his parents in a small house in the Dixie Hills neighborhood, a community that had seen several of the victims disappear. He was intelligent but socially awkward, a man with big ambitions of becoming a famous music producer, but who had met with little success. He drove around the city in his distinctive white station wagon, trying to recruit young, aspiring black musicians for his various projects. He often presented himself as a talent scout, a powerful figure who could make them stars. This persona, investigators believed, was the perfect lure. It gave him a plausible reason to approach and interact with the young boys and men who made up the victim pool. The surveillance on Williams was now 24/7. Agents followed him everywhere. They began to build a circumstantial case against him, piece by piece. The most compelling evidence came from the crime lab. Forensic scientists began a painstaking examination of fibers found on the bodies of the victims. They discovered a particular type of unusual, yellowish-green nylon fiber and fibers from a violet acetate material on the bodies of multiple victims, including Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. When investigators executed a search warrant on the Williams home, they found the source. The yellowish-green fibers were a perfect match for the carpeting in his bedroom. The violet fibers matched the material of his bedspread. Then came the dog hairs. Hairs from a dog, consistent with Williams's own German Shepherd, were also found on several of the victims. The fiber and hair evidence was a powerful link, a microscopic thread that seemed to tie Wayne Williams directly to more than a dozen of the murdered children and young adults. On June 21, 1981, nearly 2 years after the first bodies were found, the Atlanta Task Force made its move. Based on the overwhelming circumstantial and forensic evidence connecting him to the last 2 victims, Wayne Williams was arrested and charged with the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. The city of Atlanta breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caught. The 2-year nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. The hunt had ended, and the trial was about to begin. The trial of Wayne Williams began in January 1982, and it was far more than a simple murder trial. It was the culmination of a city's 2-year trauma, a legal proceeding that carried the weight of 29 unsolved murders and the grief of an entire community. Officially, Williams was only on trial for the murders of 2 adult men, 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater and 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office, led by prosecutor Jack Mallard, made a strategic decision not to charge Williams with any of the child murders. They believed the evidence connecting him to the adult victims was more direct and less emotionally fraught, offering a clearer path to conviction. However, their entire strategy was to use the trial as a proxy for the entire series of crimes, to prove to the jury and to the world that Wayne Williams was the singular monster responsible for the entire reign of terror. The prosecution's case was a formidable, if entirely circumstantial, mountain of evidence. The cornerstone of their argument was the groundbreaking field of fiber analysis. For weeks, they paraded a series of expert witnesses from the FBI crime lab to the stand. These experts testified with scientific certainty about the yellowish-green carpet fibers and the violet bedspread fibers found in the Williams home. They explained the complex process of microscopic comparison, detailing how these specific fibers were a statistical match to fibers found on the bodies of not just Payne and Cater, but on 10 other victims from the official task force list. The odds of another home in Atlanta having the exact same combination of aged, unusual carpet and bedspread were, they argued, astronomically low, 1 in millions. They presented charts and graphs, weaving a narrative of microscopic threads that physically linked Wayne Williams from his own bedroom to a dozen of the dead. The prosecution also built a powerful behavioral case against Williams. They called witnesses who testified to seeing Williams with several of the victims shortly before they disappeared. They painted a picture of him as a predator, a man who used his aspirations as a music promoter to lure vulnerable young black men and boys into his orbit with promises of fame and fortune. They detailed his history as a police impersonator and his strange, obsessive habit of monitoring police scanners, suggesting a deep-seated and unusual interest in law enforcement activities. The prosecutors argued that the late-night splash heard from the Jackson Parkway Bridge was the sound of Williams dumping Nathaniel Cater's body, the act of a serial killer caught in the middle of his ritual. The defense, led by attorneys Al Binder and Mary Welcome, faced an uphill battle. They attacked the prosecution's case at its foundations. They argued that the fiber evidence was junk science, an unproven and unreliable forensic technique that was being presented to the jury as infallible fact. They brought in their own experts who testified that fiber matches are not as unique as fingerprints or DNA, and that the statistical probabilities cited by the FBI were wildly exaggerated. They contended that the fibers could have been transferred through casual, innocent contact, or even contaminated by investigators themselves. Most powerfully, the defense argued that Williams was being made a scapegoat. They claimed that the city of Atlanta, desperate to end the panic and close the books on a politically damaging crisis, had rushed to judgment, fixating on the first plausible suspect they found. They pointed to the fact that the killings had stopped almost immediately after Williams's arrest and the intense media coverage that followed, arguing that the real killer or killers had simply gone to ground. They also hinted at a more sinister possibility, one that resonated with a segment of the Black community that was deeply distrustful of the official narrative. That the murders were not the work of a lone Black man, but of the Ku Klux Klan, part of a racist conspiracy to terrorize the city that the establishment was now trying to cover up by framing an innocent Black man. The climax of the trial came when Wayne Williams himself took the stand. It was a high-risk gamble by the defense, but one they felt they had to take. On the stand, Williams was a complex and contradictory figure. He was intelligent, articulate, and at times charming. He calmly and confidently denied any involvement in the murders. But under the intense, aggressive cross-examination by the prosecution, his composure began to crack. He became angry, argumentative, and belligerent. He railed against the prosecution, the police, and the media, portraying himself as the victim of a massive conspiracy. His angry outbursts and perceived arrogance did not play well with the jury. The confident denial he had hoped to project came across instead as the frustrated rage of a guilty man cornered. After 9 weeks of testimony and more than 60 witnesses, the case went to the jury. The jury, composed of 8 Black and 4 white members, deliberated for just over 11 hours. On February 27, 1982, they returned with their verdict. They found Wayne Williams guilty on both counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. For the city of Atlanta and for the task force, the verdict was a definitive victory. The case was closed. Shortly after the conviction, law enforcement officials held a press conference and announced that the conviction of Wayne Williams had, in their view, solved not just the murders of Payne and Cater, but at least 22 of the 29 murders on the official Atlanta child murders list. They declared the reign of terror over and officially disbanded the special task force. The green ribbons began to come down. The city, exhausted and traumatized, tried to move on, to put the nightmare behind it. But for many, especially the families of the victims for whose murders no one was ever charged, the case was far from closed. The conviction of Wayne Williams did not bring the peace and certainty they had hoped for. A host of troubling, unanswered questions remained. Williams was convicted on purely circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to any of the murders, no confession, and no murder weapon was ever found. And the fact that he was only tried for the murder of 2 adults left the deaths of more than 24 children legally unresolved. A deep and persistent doubt began to take root, a feeling that the full truth of the Atlanta child murders had not been told, and that the man behind bars might not be the only, or even the real, monster responsible for the city's stolen children. In the decades following the trial, the conviction of Wayne Williams, which was intended to be the final, authoritative chapter in a dark period of Atlanta's history, instead became the subject of persistent doubt, debate, and reinvestigation. The official closure provided by the verdict failed to satisfy many of the victims' families, and a growing number of independent journalists, authors, and documentarians who believed the case was a profound miscarriage of justice. The doubts centered on several key areas. The fiber evidence, so crucial to the prosecution's case, came under increasing scrutiny as the years went on. Critics pointed out that the science was new and its statistical certainty had been oversold to the jury. The possibility of contamination, both at the crime scenes and in the lab, was a real concern. Moreover, the very ubiquity of the fibers was a double-edged sword. While the prosecution argued it linked Williams to a dozen victims, the defense contended that it was more likely evidence of a widespread environmental contaminant or a flaw in the collection process rather than proof of a single killer. Questions also lingered about the other evidence that was never fully pursued. In several of the cases, witnesses had reported seeing white suspects or white vehicles near the abduction sites, leads that were largely dismissed once the task force began to focus on the single black killer theory, the theory that the Ku Klux Klan or another white supremacist group was involved. While dismissed by law enforcement, never entirely went away. Proponents of this theory pointed to a supposed KKK plot to incite a race war by killing black children, claiming that a Klansman had even confessed his involvement to an informant. While these claims were never substantiated with enough evidence to be actionable, they contributed to a powerful counter-narrative that the authorities had framed Williams to avoid confronting a far more explosive racial truth. The victims' families were perhaps the most vocal and persistent critics. For the parents of the 20-plus children whose cases were closed without ever going to trial, there was no sense of justice. They felt their children had been used as pattern evidence to convict a man for other crimes, and that the specific facts of their own cases had been swept under the rug. Many of them never believed Williams was responsible. They spoke of other suspects, of local neighborhood figures they had long been suspicious of leads they felt the police had ignored in their rush to pin everything on one man. Their grief was compounded by a sense of being unheard, their children's murders relegated to a footnote in the larger saga of Wayne Williams. Over the years, Williams himself has maintained his innocence from prison, tirelessly filing appeals and seeking a new trial. He has become a cause célèbre for activists and legal scholars who see his case as a textbook example of a wrongful conviction fueled by media hysteria and political pressure. Several high-profile efforts have been made to re-examine the case. In the mid-1980s, an investigation by Spin magazine raised serious questions about the KKK's potential involvement. In 2010, a documentary called The Atlanta Child Murders revisited the case, highlighting the inconsistencies in the official story and interviewing jurors who expressed second thoughts about their verdict. The most significant official re-examination came in 2005. The DeKalb County Police Chief, Louis Graham, decided to reopen the cases of 4 of the victims whose bodies had been found in his jurisdiction. Graham was a vocal skeptic of the single killer theory, stating publicly that he believed it was an injustice to claim that Williams was responsible for all the murders. His investigation, however, hit a wall, unable to produce enough new evidence to bring charges against any other suspects. The advent of modern DNA technology offered the most promising avenue for finding definitive answers. In 2007, DNA testing was performed on 2 human hairs found on the body of 11-year-old victim Patrick Baltazar. The mitochondrial DNA from the hairs did not match Wayne Williams. While this did not exonerate Williams, the hairs could have come from another source. It did prove that someone else had contact with the victim. More advanced testing on the dog hairs found on several victims did, however, match Williams's German Shepherd, strengthening the original prosecution's case against him in those specific instances. The DNA evidence, like everything else in this case, was ambiguous, offering ammunition for both sides but no final, conclusive truth. In 2019, driven by the renewed public interest generated by new podcasts and documentaries, Atlanta's then-mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced that the city would be re-examining the evidence in all 29 cases using the latest DNA technology. It was a momentous announcement, a long-overdue acknowledgement of the lingering doubts and the pain of the victims' families. The goal, she stated, was not necessarily to exonerate Wayne Williams, but to bring a measure of peace and certainty to the families, to test every piece of evidence in the hope that modern science could finally answer the questions that had haunted the city for 4 decades. As of today, the results of that re-examination have not been made public, and Wayne Williams remains in prison, now a man in his late 60s. The Atlanta child murders case endures as a deep and painful scar on the city's history. It is a story that encapsulates the complexities of race, class, and justice in America. It's a tragedy that raises profound questions about the nature of evidence, the fallibility of the legal system, and the seductive, dangerous allure of a simple solution to a complex horror. Was Wayne Williams a monstrous, Prolific serial killer? A predator who single-handedly terrorized a city? Or was he a convenient scapegoat, a victim of a flawed investigation that was desperate to close the book on a nightmare, possibly allowing other killers to escape justice? Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that both could be true. Williams may well have been responsible for some of the murders, while other predators, seeing an opportunity in the climate of fear, were responsible for others. The city may not have been haunted by a single monster, but by several. Until science can provide a definitive answer, the case remains a troubling, open wound, and the ghosts of Atlanta's stolen children continue to wait for a justice that has proven to be as elusive as their killer. The Stanford Prison Experiment in the summer of 1971, the campus of Stanford University, like so many others across America, was a place of quiet unease. The revolutionary fervor of the late 1960s had begun to curdle, leaving behind a residue of disillusionment and a host of unanswered, deeply troubling questions about human nature. The war in Vietnam was raging on. The trial of the Manson family had just concluded, and the nation was grappling with a profound sense of division. It was a time of questioning authority, of challenging institutions, and of trying to understand the darker currents that ran just beneath the surface of civilized society. And in the basement of the university's psychology department, a young, ambitious social psychologist was about to conduct an experiment that would peer so deeply into those dark currents that its findings would haunt the world for decades to come. His name was Philip Zimbardo. He was a 38-year-old professor, fascinated by the power of situations to shape human behavior. He wanted to explore a fundamental, age-old question. What happens when you put good people in an evil place? Is it the individual's morality, their innate goodness or badness, that determines their actions? Or is it the situation itself, the environment and the roles we are asked to play, that holds the greater power? Does the bad apple spoil the barrel? Or does the bad barrel turn good apples rotten? To find the answer, he devised a study of unprecedented and, as it would turn out, terrifying realism. He was going to build a prison. The experiment began with a simple, innocuous-looking ad placed in the classified section of the Palo Alto Times. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. The response was overwhelming. More than 70 young men applied, drawn by the promise of easy money for what sounded like a straightforward, if unusual, summer job. From this pool of applicants, Zimbardo and his team of graduate students conducted a rigorous screening process. They administered a battery of psychological tests and interviews, deliberately weeding out anyone with a history of psychological problems, criminal behavior, or medical issues. They were left with a group of 24 young men who were, by every conceivable measure, the cream of the crop. They were healthy, intelligent, and psychologically stable. They were, in Zimbardo's words, the most normal average young men one could find. These 24 good apples were then brought to the basement of Jordan Hall, the home of Stanford's psychology department. There, Zimbardo had transformed a drab corridor into a makeshift correctional facility. He called it the Stanford County Prison. 3 small laboratory rooms had been converted into cells, their doors replaced with black steel bars. A small, unlit closet at the end of the hall, too small to even lie down in, was designated as the solitary confinement cell. It was known simply as the hole. The corridor itself became the prison yard, and an observation room behind a screen allowed the researchers to watch and record everything. The atmosphere was deliberately oppressive, designed to strip away the familiar comforts of the outside world. The 24 participants were gathered, and in a moment that sealed their fate, a coin was flipped. Half were randomly assigned to be prisoners, the other half to be guards. Neither group was chosen for any particular personality trait. Their roles were determined entirely by chance. Zimbardo himself would not be a neutral, objective observer. He cast himself in a role as well, the prison superintendent. His lead graduate student would be the warden. From the very beginning, the researchers were not just studying the situation. They were part of it. The guards were brought in first for an orientation. They were given simple, military-style khaki uniforms, a nightstick, and a pair of reflective, silvered sunglasses, a crucial prop borrowed from the film Cool Hand Luke. The sunglasses were designed to make them anonymous and intimidating, to prevent any real eye contact with the prisoners. Zimbardo gave them their instructions. Their job was to maintain law and order in the prison. They were told they could create a sense of boredom, a degree of fear, and a feeling of powerlessness in the prisoners. You can create in them a sense of arbitrariness, he told them, that their life is totally controlled by us, by the system, you, me. Critically, he told them they could not use physical violence. Beyond that, the rules of how to be a guard were left intentionally vague. They were free to improvise. For the prisoners, the experiment began with a shocking dose of realism. On a quiet Sunday morning, without any warning, a real Palo Alto police car, with its sirens screaming, pulled up outside the homes of each of the prisoners. They were charged with armed robbery and burglary, read their Miranda rights, and arrested in full view of their stunned neighbors. They were handcuffed, thrown in the back of the police car, and taken to the actual police station. There, they were fingerprinted, a real booking photo was taken, and they were placed in a holding cell. Blindfolded, they were then transported to the basement of Jordan Hall. At the Stanford County Prison, the degradation ceremony began. The prisoners were stripped naked, sprayed with a delousing agent, which was actually just a deodorant spray, and left to stand naked and shivering in the yard. They were then issued their uniforms, a rough, ill-fitting smock or dress, with their prisoner number printed on the front and back. They were given no underwear. The smocks were designed to be emasculating, to make them feel less like men. A heavy chain was bolted to their right ankle, a constant physical reminder of their imprisonment. On their heads, they were forced to wear a cap made from a woman's nylon stocking, meant to simulate the shaven heads of new convicts. From that moment on, their names were gone. They were to be referred to only by their number. The first day was a mixture of awkwardness and tentative role-playing. The guards, feeling a bit self-conscious in their uniforms, began to test the limits of their new authority. They roused the prisoners in the middle of the night for counts, forcing them to recite their numbers over and over. The prisoners, still seeing it as just an experiment, were largely compliant, if a bit resentful. But as the first day bled into the second, the lines between the experiment and reality, between role-playing and identity, began to blur with a speed and intensity that no one, not even Philip Zimbardo, could have possibly anticipated. The bad barrel was beginning its work. The second day of the experiment began with a rebellion. The prisoners, stripped of their names and subjected to the guards' arbitrary late-night counts, decided to push back. They barricaded their cell doors with their beds, ripped off their stocking caps, and began to taunt and curse the guards. It was a moment of collective defiance, a rejection of the roles they had been assigned. For the guards on the morning shift, this was an affront to their authority, a direct challenge to the order they had been tasked to maintain, and their reaction was swift, unified, and unexpectedly harsh. The guards called in reinforcements from the other shifts. In a coordinated show of force, they blasted the barricaded cells with a fire extinguisher, which shot a freezing cold spray of carbon dioxide. They broke into the cells, stripped the prisoners naked again, took away their beds, and placed the ringleaders of the rebellion into solitary confinement. The rebellion was crushed, and in its place, a new, more insidious psychological strategy began to emerge from the guards. They decided to create a privilege cell. They took the 3 prisoners who had been least involved in the rebellion and put them in a separate cell. They gave them back their uniforms, their beds, and even gave them special food to eat, which they were allowed to consume in front of the other prisoners who had been denied meals. The goal was to break the solidarity that had formed among the inmates, to sow suspicion and distrust. After a few hours, they then shuffled the prisoners, taking some of the bad prisoners and putting them in the good cell and vice versa with no explanation. The tactic worked perfectly. The prisoners, no longer sure who to trust, began to see each other not as allies in a shared struggle, but as potential informants. The solidarity was broken. It was at this point that the guards' behavior began to escalate from simple rule enforcement to creative, and often sadistic, forms of psychological punishment. The line between their real selves and their assigned roles was rapidly dissolving. They began to relish their power, improvising new ways to humiliate and degrade the prisoners. The late-night counts became elaborate rituals, sometimes lasting for hours. They forced the prisoners to do push-ups, often with a guard stepping on their backs. They denied them access to the toilet, forcing them to use a bucket in their cell, which they were often not allowed to empty, leaving the cells to fill with the stench of human waste. They played mind games, turning simple requests into opportunities for humiliation. The power dynamic was no longer an act. It was becoming real, and the prisoners were changing, too. Their initial defiance was replaced by a kind of learned helplessness. They became passive, docile, and depressed. They began to internalize their roles, speaking and acting like real prisoners, their conversations revolving almost entirely around prison life. Some began to show signs of extreme emotional distress. On just the second day, prisoner number 8612 began to suffer from an acute emotional disturbance. He was screaming, crying, and flying into uncontrollable rages. He was no longer playing a role. He was having a genuine breakdown. Initially, Zimbardo and the guards believed he was faking it, trying to manipulate his way out of the experiment. But his suffering was so palpable, so authentic, that they were finally forced to release him. The experiment had claimed its first casualty. The researchers themselves were also being drawn deeper into the vortex of the prison simulation. Philip Zimbardo, in his role as prison superintendent, found himself thinking less like a research psychologist and more like an administrator concerned with security and control. His primary concern was no longer the collection of data, but the stability of his prison. When the prisoners rebelled, his first instinct was not to observe their behavior, but to help the guards crush the uprising. He was losing his scientific objectivity, becoming an active participant in the very system he had created. This was starkly illustrated by a rumor that swept through the prison on the third day. The guards overheard the prisoners talking about an escape plan. They believed that the released prisoner, number 8612, was going to return with a group of his friends to break everyone out. Zimbardo's reaction was not that of a scientist observing a fascinating development. It was that of a panicked prison official. He and his team dismantled the prison, moved the remaining prisoners to a different floor of the building, and Zimbardo himself sat in the lobby, waiting, planning to tell the supposed escape party that the experiment had been terminated. The escape never materialized. It was just a rumor, but the incident revealed how deeply Zimbardo himself had been sucked into the reality of the simulation. The guards, for their part, continued to grow more tyrannical. One guard, in particular, a student named Dave Eshelman, fully embraced his role, modeling his behavior on the brutal prison warden from the movie Cool Hand Luke. He adopted a thick Southern accent and a cruel, inventive sadism. He became known to the prisoners only as John Wayne. He was the one who initiated many of the most degrading punishments, seemingly enjoying the psychological torment he was inflicting. Years later, he would explain that he had seen the experiment as a form of improvisational theater and had deliberately created a character. But the effect on the prisoners was undeniably real. By the fourth day, the situation had deteriorated even further. The researchers arranged for a Catholic priest to visit the prison to see how the simulation compared to real prison life. The priest interviewed the prisoners, and an unsettling thing happened. When he asked them their names, they gave him their numbers. When he asked them what they were doing to get out, they spoke of lawyers and appeals, not of simply quitting the experiment. They had forgotten they were student volunteers in a psychological study. They had accepted the prison as their reality. The lines were blurring for everyone. Parents who came to visit during a designated visiting hour were horrified by the state of their sons, but were manipulated by the prison staff into thinking their concerns were overblown. Another prisoner, number 819, broke down, weeping hysterically. Zimbardo tried to comfort him, but the boy sobbed that he couldn't leave because the other prisoners had labeled him a bad prisoner. Zimbardo had to forcefully remind him, "You are not number 819. You are his name, and I am Dr. Zimbardo. I'm a psychologist, not a prison superintendent, and this is not a real prison. This is just an experiment, and those are students, not prisoners, just like you. Let's go." It was a moment of shocking clarity, a brief piercing of the veil of the simulation, revealing how deeply the roles had taken root in the minds of everyone involved. The experiment was spiraling out of control, and the bad barrel was proving to be more powerful than anyone could have imagined. By the 5th day, the basement of Jordan Hall had transformed into a psychological pressure cooker, a place where the ordinary rules of human interaction had been completely suspended and replaced by the brutal logic of the prison. The guards had, without any explicit instruction, divided themselves into 3 distinct types. There were the good guards, who were tough but fair, followed the rules, and occasionally did small favors for the prisoners. There was a second group who were passive, the go-along guards who did not actively participate in the torment but did nothing to stop it, effectively giving their tacit approval. And then there was the third group, about a third of the guards, who became actively cruel and tyrannical. These were the guards, like the infamous John Wayne, who seemed to relish their absolute power, who invented new, creative forms of humiliation, and who pushed the boundaries of the experiment's no physical violence rule to their absolute limit. Their cruelty was most evident during the night shift, when they believed the researchers were not watching as closely. The punishments became more degrading and more bizarre. The guards would force the prisoners to simulate sodomy, to clean toilets with their bare hands, and to endure long periods of sleep deprivation. The power had corrupted them, not because they were inherently bad people, but because the situation had given them permission to be. They had been given a role, a uniform, and a sense of institutional support, and that was all it took to unlock a darkness they likely never knew they possessed. The prisoners, for their part, had sunk deeper into a state of pathological passivity. Their will was broken. They were listless, demoralized, and emotionally drained. The concept of quitting the experiment seemed to have vanished from their minds. They had fully internalized the identity of the prisoner, their reality defined by the arbitrary whims of the guards. The situation had devolved to such an extent that even Philip Zimbardo, the experiment's creator and superintendent, was unable to see how far things had gone. He was so enmeshed in his role, so focused on the logistics of his prison, that he had lost the critical, objective distance of a scientist. He was observing the data, noting the escalating abuse, but he saw it as a fascinating, successful demonstration of his hypothesis, not as an immediate ethical crisis that needed to be stopped. His entire research team had fallen into the same trap. They were all part of the system, cogs in the machine they had created. The person who finally broke the spell was an outsider. On the evening of the 5th day, a young PhD graduate from Stanford named Christina Maslach came to the prison to conduct interviews. She was Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, and later his wife. She had not been involved in the day-to-day running of the experiment and was seeing it for the first time with fresh eyes. As she walked down the corridor, observing the yard, she saw a line of prisoners, bags over their heads, their legs chained together, being led by a guard on their way to the toilet. The guard was yelling at them, degrading them. The other guards were laughing. Maslach was horrified. She didn't see a clever simulation. She saw young men being systematically abused and humiliated. She saw real human suffering. She turned to Zimbardo and, in a moment of profound moral clarity, confronted him. "It's terrible what you are doing to those boys," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Zimbardo, initially defensive, tried to explain the scientific importance of what they were witnessing, but she was unswayed. "What is the independent variable in this study?" she challenged him, using the language of their shared profession. She was pointing out that he had become the experiment's most powerful variable, that his own role-playing was shaping the outcome. Her emotional, visceral reaction was the shock to the system that Zimbardo and his team desperately needed. Her words forced Zimbardo to step outside of his role as prison superintendent and see the experiment for what it had become. He looked at the videotapes, at the exhausted, broken state of the prisoners, at the casual cruelty of the guards, and he finally saw what Maslach had seen. This was no longer a controlled scientific study. It was an out-of-control demonstration of the power of a toxic situation to corrupt ordinary, decent people. The experiment had proven its point all too well. It was a stunning success in terms of its scientific findings, but it was a profound ethical failure. On the morning of the 6th day, Zimbardo gathered the prisoners and the guards. The experiment, which had been scheduled to last for 2 full weeks, was being terminated immediately. He was shutting it down. The announcement was met with a strange, mixed reaction. The prisoners were relieved, but some of the guards were genuinely disappointed. They had grown to enjoy their power, to enjoy their role, and they were sorry to see it end. Zimbardo then brought all the participants together for a series of debriefing sessions. It was a difficult, emotional process of trying to de-roll everyone. To help them understand what had just happened, they watched the videotapes together. The young men who had played the guards were shocked and often disgusted by their own behavior. Many of them claimed they had no idea they were capable of such cruelty. "I thought I was a good person," one of them said. "But I wasn't a good person." The young men who had played the prisoners talked about their feelings of powerlessness, of how quickly they had submitted to authority, and how real the prison had felt to them. The immediate aftermath was a period of intense reflection and, for Zimbardo, a reckoning with the ethical implications of his own work. He had created a situation so powerful that it had not only overwhelmed the participants but had overwhelmed him as well. He had seen firsthand how easy it was for good people to become perpetrators of evil, and how easy it was for others to become passive bystanders, allowing the evil to happen. He had also learned a powerful lesson about the seductive nature of power and the fine line between scientific observation and active participation. The Stanford prison experiment was over, but its story was just beginning. Zimbardo began to write and lecture about his findings, and the experiment quickly became one of the most famous and most controversial studies in the history of psychology. It was a stark, dramatic, and deeply unsettling demonstration of the power of the situation, a chilling echo of real-world atrocities from Nazi Germany to the prisons of the modern day. The study seemed to offer a profound, if pessimistic, insight into the human condition, that the capacity for both good and evil lies within us all, waiting only for the right situation to be unlocked. The bad barrel had proven to be a terrifyingly powerful force. The legacy of the Stanford prison experiment is as complex and contested as the study itself. In the immediate aftermath and for decades following, it was hailed as a landmark achievement in social psychology. Philip Zimbardo's central conclusion, that situational forces can overwhelm individual personality and morality, became a cornerstone of psychology textbooks and a powerful, accessible explanation for real-world atrocities. The experiment provided a chilling framework for understanding how ordinary people could commit extraordinary acts of evil, not because they were inherently monstrous, but because they were placed in situations that gave them permission, or even encouragement, to do so. Zimbardo termed this phenomenon the Lucifer effect, the transformation of good people into perpetrators of evil. He argued that the study's findings could be applied to understand everything from the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide to the abuses committed by American soldiers at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. In fact, Zimbardo himself was called to serve as an expert witness for the defense of one of the Abu Ghraib guards, arguing that the soldier was a good apple who had been corrupted by the bad barrel of a toxic, unsupervised, and stressful prison environment. The Stanford prison experiment, he contended, was not just a historical curiosity. It was a vital, living lesson about the systems of power and the situational pressures that can lead to inhumanity. The study became a cultural touchstone, its narrative so powerful and dramatic that it has been retold in numerous documentaries, television shows, and 2 feature films. The images of the prisoners in their smocks, the guards in their reflective sunglasses, and the whole have become iconic symbols of the dark potential that lies within social roles and institutional power. The experiment's central, terrifying idea that you, too, could become a brutal prison guard under the right circumstances resonated deeply with a public grappling with the horrors of the 20th century. However, in more recent years, the Stanford prison experiment has come under intense scrutiny and criticism from a new generation of psychologists and journalists. These critiques have challenged not only the ethical foundations of the study but the validity of its famous conclusions. One of the most significant criticisms centers on the concept of demand characteristics. This is the idea that participants in an experiment are not passive subjects, but are actively trying to figure out what the researchers want from them and then modify their behavior accordingly. Critics argue that the guards were not simply naturally becoming tyrannical. They were actively encouraged to do so by Zimbardo and his team. They point to the initial orientation, where Zimbardo explicitly told the guards to create feelings of powerlessness and fear. This, they argue, was not a neutral instruction. It was a clear directive to be cruel. The guards, in this view, were not succumbing to a situation. They were enthusiastically playing the role they believed the lead researcher wanted them to play. This is bolstered by the account of Dave Eshelman, the guard known as John Wayne, who admitted that he was consciously creating a character, seeing the experiment as an exercise in improvisational acting. The critics contend that the experiment was less a scientific study of human nature and more a piece of manufactured and highly effective political theater. This critique gained significant traction in 2018 with the release of newly unearthed recordings of the experiment. On these tapes, Zimbardo's warden, David Jaffe, can be heard actively coaching one of the guards who was seen as too lenient. The guards have to know that every guard is going to be what we call a tough guard, Jaffe instructs him. He pressures the guard to be more firm, to get more involved. This recording provided powerful evidence that the guard's behavior was not an organic development but was actively shaped and encouraged by the researchers themselves, a clear violation of scientific protocol. Furthermore, the breakdown of prisoner number 8612, which Zimbardo had long presented as evidence of the situation's overwhelming power, was also re-examined. The prisoner, Douglas Corpy, revealed in later interviews that his breakdown was not a genuine emotional collapse, but was largely faked. He had signed up for the experiment believing he would have quiet time to study for his graduate school entrance exams. When he realized this wouldn't be possible and that his requests to leave were being denied, he decided to fake a breakdown as his only way out. While he admitted the experience was stressful, he maintained that the primary driver of his behavior was a desire to quit the study, not a descent into madness. These revelations have led many in the modern psychological community to dismiss the Stanford prison experiment as deeply flawed, unscientific, and more of an anecdotal demonstration than a true experiment. They argue that its conclusions are overly simplistic and deterministic, offering a convenient excuse for bad behavior by blaming the situation rather than holding individuals accountable for their choices. They point out that even within the experiment, not all the guards became cruel. Some were kind and many were passive. This, they argue, shows that individual personality and morality do play a significant role, even in the most powerful of situations. Today, the Stanford prison experiment occupies a strange and contested space. It has been removed from many psychology textbooks, and its methods would be considered so grossly unethical that it could never be replicated. Yet, its story endures, its narrative power seemingly immune to the scientific critiques. It remains a potent, if flawed, parable. Philip Zimbardo has consistently defended his work, arguing that the critiques misinterpret the study's core findings and downplay the very real suffering experienced by the prisoners. He maintains that the experiment, despite its flaws, offers an invaluable lesson about the power of systemic and situational forces. The debate continues, but what is undeniable is the experiment's profound and lasting impact. It forced the field of psychology to establish much stricter ethical guidelines for research involving human subjects. And it forced a broader cultural conversation about the nature of power, the fragility of morality, and the ease with which the line between good and evil can be blurred. The prison in the basement of Jordan Hall may have been fake, but it revealed a truth about the human capacity for darkness that remains as unsettling and relevant today as it was in the summer of 1971. The Columbine High School massacre in the spring of 1999, Littleton, Colorado, was the very picture of American suburban tranquility. It was an affluent, sprawling community nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, a place of comfortable, two-story homes, green lawns, and a quiet, unassuming sense of safety. Its heart was Columbine High School, a large, modern campus that served nearly 2,000 students. It was a typical American high school, a world of jocks and preps, of drama kids and computer nerds, a place defined by the familiar rhythms of pep rallies, final exams, and the anxious, hopeful energy of teenagers on the cusp of adulthood. It was a place that felt profoundly, reassuringly normal, a world insulated from the kind of violence that seemed to belong only to distant, troubled cities or the evening news. But inside this picture of normalcy, in the basements and bedrooms of two of its students, a private world of profound darkness was being meticulously constructed. The architects of this world were two teenage boys, 18-year-old Eric Harris and 17-year-old Dylan Klebold. To the outside world, they were largely invisible, part of a loose-knit group of outcasts who called themselves the Trenchcoat Mafia. Though they were only on the periphery of the group, they were seen as quiet, intelligent, and a bit strange. Harris was the son of an Air Force pilot, a new kid in town who was small in stature, but possessed a sharp, aggressive intelligence. Klebold was a local boy, tall, gangly, and shy, a gifted student from the school's advanced placement program who came from a loving, intellectual, and pacifist family. They were, in many ways, an odd pairing. Harris was the clear leader, a boy simmering with a cold, calculated, and all-consuming rage against the world. Klebold was his follower, a deeply depressed and suicidal teenager who seemed to find a sense of purpose and a partner for his own exit in Harris's nihilistic vision. Together, they inhabited a secret, shared universe fueled by violent video games like Doom, industrial music, and a growing, obsessive fascination with weapons and destruction. This secret world found its most potent expression online and in the pages of their private journals. Eric Harris, in particular, was a prolific and chilling chronicler of his own descent. On a series of websites, he posted his own custom-built levels for the video game Doom, but he also posted vitriolic, hate-filled rants against everyone and everything he despised: his classmates, his teachers, his neighbors, and humanity in general. His rage was not targeted. It was global. "I hate the fucking world," he wrote. His journals were even more disturbing, a detailed record of a budding psychopath. He wrote of his sense of superiority, his desire for absolute power, and his elaborate, violent fantasies. Klebold's writings, by contrast, were filled with a different kind of darkness. His journals were a testament to a deep, agonizing depression, a sense of alienation, and a romantic, almost poetic, longing for love and, ultimately, for death. "I'm in a state of being, of having no one, and wanting a special someone," he wrote, his pages filled with hearts and drawings of a lonely figure walking away. His was a pain turned inward, a desperate desire to end his own suffering. It was the fusion of Harris's homicidal rage with Klebold's suicidal depression that created the volatile, explosive compound that would lead to tragedy. Their shared fantasy began to crystallize into a concrete plan, an event they referred to in their journals as NBK, an homage to the Oliver Stone film Natural Born Killers. But their true inspiration, the event that showed them the scale of destruction they craved, was the Oklahoma City bombing. They idolized Timothy McVeigh and were deeply impressed by the carnage he had wrought. They decided to time their own attack for April 20th, Hitler's birthday, a date chosen for its shock value and a nod to their twisted, amateurish interest in Nazi ideology. Their plan was far more ambitious and deadly than a simple school shooting. They intended to commit an act of mass terrorism that would dwarf the Oklahoma City bombing. The plan was meticulously detailed in their journals and in a series of videotapes they made in the basement of Harris's home, tapes that would come to be known as the basement tapes. On these tapes, they sat in front of a camera, dressed in their trench coats and brandishing their weapons, speaking to a world they believed would only understand them after their final, violent act. They railed against society, explained their motives, and offered a chilling, step-by-step preview of the massacre they were about to unleash. The heart of their plan was not guns, but bombs. Over several months, they had acquired a small arsenal of weapons. Using a friend who was of legal age, they purchased two 9mm firearms and two 12-gauge shotguns at a local gun show. But their real focus was on building a series of powerful propane bombs. They studied instructions on the internet and painstakingly assembled nearly 100 explosive devices of various sizes. The two largest were built from 20-pound propane tanks, the kind used for barbecue grills. The plan for April 20th was diabolical. They would enter the Columbine High School cafeteria just before the busiest lunch period and place two large bags, each containing one of the massive propane bombs, under the tables. The bombs were timed to detonate at 11:17 a.m. They calculated that the blast would kill or maim most of the nearly 500 students in the cafeteria at that time and potentially bring the ceiling, which supported the library above, crashing down. Their role with the guns was to be secondary. They planned to wait outside, on the grassy knoll at the top of the west entrance stairs, and, as the terrified survivors fled the burning, collapsing building, they would pick them off one by one. It was a plan designed for maximum carnage, a fantasy of apocalyptic destruction they hoped would kill hundreds and grant them the twisted, bloody immortality they craved. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, the two boys executed the final steps of their plan. They placed a small firebomb in a field a few miles away, set to detonate as a diversion for law enforcement. They dressed in their black trench coats, armed themselves to the teeth, and said their final, coded goodbyes. Klebold was reportedly heard telling a classmate, "I like you, go home." Harris, as he left his house that morning, told a friend who had come to visit, "Get out of here, go home." They loaded their car with weapons and bombs and drove to Columbine High School. They were no longer just angry, alienated teenagers. They were the architects of a massacre, on their way to keep what they saw as a date with destiny. The quiet suburban morning was about to be shattered by an act of violence so profound it would change America forever. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, the air at Columbine High School was filled with the mundane, familiar energy of a Tuesday. Students milled about, chatting by their lockers, heading to class. It was a B-day in their block schedule. In the cafeteria, staff were preparing for the 3 lunch periods, the first of which, a lunch, was the largest, a bustling convergence of hundreds of students. At approximately 11:10 a.m., Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, clad in their heavy black trench coats despite the mild spring weather, arrived on campus. They lugged 2 large duffel bags, each containing a 20-pound propane bomb set on a timer. They walked into the cafeteria, their movements awkward but unnoticed in the pre-lunch chaos. They placed the bags on the floor, near the support columns, in the area where the largest number of students would soon be gathering. The bombs were set to detonate at 11:17 a.m. Their work inside done, they walked back out of the school and made their way to their pre-planned positions at the top of the grassy hill, next to the west entrance, the highest point on campus. From this vantage point, they had a clear, commanding view of the cafeteria exits and the parking lot. They armed themselves, settled in, and waited for the world to end. But the world did not end. 11:17 a.m. came and went. There was no explosion. The bombs, which they had spent months painstakingly building, had failed to detonate due to a flaw in their wiring or their cheap, unreliable timers. Inside the cafeteria, hundreds of students began to fill the room, completely unaware that they were eating their lunch just feet away from 2 massive, but inert, explosive devices. For Harris and Klebold, waiting on the hill, the silence must have been maddening. Their grand, apocalyptic plan, the one designed for maximum carnage, had failed at its very first step. It was at this moment that the mission changed. The meticulously planned act of terrorism devolved into a spontaneous, chaotic, and far more personal shooting spree. Their frustration and rage, which had been building for years, now had to be unleashed directly. At 11:19 a.m., the massacre began. From their position on the hill, they opened fire on the students below them. Their first victims were 17-year-old Rachel Scott and her friend Richard Castaldo, who were sitting on the grass eating their lunch. Scott was killed instantly. Castaldo was critically wounded and paralyzed. The sound of gunfire, sharp and unfamiliar, echoed across the campus. At first, many students thought it was a senior prank, perhaps firecrackers. But then more students began to fall. 17-year-old Daniel Rohrbaugh was shot and killed as he tried to flee. Sean Graves and Lance Kirkland were also hit, collapsing to the ground, grievously wounded. The prank-like atmosphere vanished, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. Students began screaming and running for their lives, trying to scramble back into the school for cover. Harris and Klebold, now moving down the hill toward the west entrance, continued to fire indiscriminately at anyone they saw. They shot at a group of students near a soccer field, hitting 16-year-old Anne-Marie Hockelter as she tried to run. The school was descending into chaos. A Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy, Neil Gardner, who was assigned to the school as a resource officer, was one of the first to respond. Hearing the shots, he drew his weapon and exchanged fire with Eric Harris, who was still outside the west entrance. This brief gunfight was crucial. It likely prevented Harris and Klebold from going back outside to shoot at the fleeing students and first responders, forcing them instead to enter the school building itself. At 11:22 a.m., the two gunmen walked through the west doors of Columbine High School. The long, lonely hallways, usually teeming with students, were now a landscape of terror. They were filled with the smell of gunpowder, the echoing sound of the fire alarms which had been triggered, and the desperate, scattered sounds of students trying to hide. Harris and Klebold began to move through the main hallway, shooting at random, laughing and shouting as they went. They shot and wounded several students they encountered. They also threw small pipe bombs, their explosions adding to the cacophony and chaos. Their first stop inside was the school library. Unbeknownst to them at that moment, the library was directly above the cafeteria where their main bombs still sat, silent and inert. Inside the library, 52 students, 2 teachers, and 2 library staff members were hiding, crouched under tables and huddled in back offices. One of the teachers, a woman named Patty Nielsen, had seen the gunman approaching and had frantically dialed 911, her hushed, terrified voice providing a live, real-time audio recording of the horror that was about to unfold. "The school is in a panic," she whispered to the dispatcher. "And I'm in the library. I've got children down on the floor." But Harris and Klebold did not enter the library yet. They continued their rampage through the hallways, eventually making their way back toward the cafeteria. They stood on the staircase overlooking the room, firing down at the unexploded bombs, trying to get them to detonate. Miraculously, they still failed to go off. They then threw another pipe bomb into the area, which did explode, but the secondary blast failed to trigger the propane tanks. After this failed attempt, they walked through the now empty cafeteria, got drinks from the fountain, and then began to make their way back upstairs. Their destination this time was the library. At 11:29 a.m., Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold entered the Columbine High School library. The 56 people hiding inside were trapped. The gunmen walked in, and one of them shouted, "Get up!" They then yelled, "All jocks stand up. We're gonna get the guys in the white hats," a reference to the white baseball caps that were a popular accessory for the school's athletes, a group they particularly despised. No one stood up. The library, which should have been a place of quiet study, had just become a killing field. The most intense and brutal part of the massacre was about to begin. The 7.5 minutes that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold spent in the Columbine High School library represented the dark, murderous heart of their rampage. The library, a sanctuary of knowledge and quiet, was transformed into a theater of sadistic cruelty and arbitrary execution. For the 56 people huddled under tables and hiding in back rooms, it was an eternity of pure terror, their lives hanging on the whims of 2 teenage boys who had appointed themselves gods. Harris and Klebold moved through the library with a chilling, almost casual demeanor. They were laughing, taunting their victims, and seemingly enjoying the absolute power they now wielded. The attack was no longer an indiscriminate shooting spree. It had become a slow, deliberate, and deeply personal hunt. They walked from table to table, peering underneath, making eye contact with the terrified students before opening fire. One of the first students they targeted was Kyle Velasquez, who was hiding under a computer table. They shot and killed him. They then moved toward a table where Cassie, Bernal, Emily Wyant, and Bree Pasquale were hiding. Harris slapped the top of the table twice and said, "Peekaboo," before firing his shotgun underneath, killing Cassie Bernal instantly. A story would later emerge and become a national sensation that the gunman had asked Bernal if she believed in God before killing her, and that she had answered, yes. This narrative of Christian martyrdom, while powerful, was later disputed by the other survivors at the table, who stated that the exchange never happened. The question was likely posed to another student, Valine Schnur, who was wounded but survived. The gunmen continued their methodical slaughter. They shot and killed Stephen Kerno and Corey DePuter under another table. They taunted and wounded other students, including Valine Schnur and Lisa Kreutz, One of the most haunting interactions occurred with a student named Patrick Ireland. Klebold fired at him, hitting him twice in the head and once in the foot, knocking him unconscious. They approached a table where two students, Isaiah Shoels and Matthew Kechter, were hiding. Shoels was one of the few African-American students at Columbine. Klebold and Harris directed a series of racist slurs at him before Harris shot and killed him at point-blank range. Klebold then killed Matthew Kechter. The shooters reloaded their weapons multiple times, the sound of magazines clicking into place echoing through the silent, terrified library. They seemed to be acting without any clear plan, choosing their victims at random. At one point, they stood near a window and began firing at the police and paramedics who were gathering outside, forcing them to take cover and further delaying any potential rescue attempt. After their initial wave of killing, they gathered near the center of the library and spoke to each other. One of them was heard saying they were no longer having fun, that shooting was getting boring. They seemed to be losing their adrenaline-fueled momentum. Dylan Klebold threw one last pipe bomb toward the far corner of the library, and then at 11:36 a.m., the two of them walked out, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. In just over 7 minutes, they had killed 10 students and wounded 12 others. The library was silent again, save for the hushed sobs of the wounded and the incessant drone of the fire alarm. While the massacre was unfolding inside, the situation outside the school was one of growing chaos and confusion. The first law enforcement officers on the scene had followed the standard protocol for the time: secure a perimeter, contain the situation, and wait for a specialized SWAT team to arrive and make entry. This doctrine was based on the assumption that they were dealing with a barricaded suspect or a hostage situation, not an active shooter scenario where every passing second meant more potential casualties. As a result, for nearly an hour, police and sheriff's deputies surrounded the school but did not go in. They were engaged in sporadic gunfights with the shooters through the windows, but the command structure was fragmented, and there was no coordinated plan to breach the building and confront the killers. Parents, who had heard the news and were rushing to the school, were held back behind police lines, frantic and desperate for information. The media arrived in force, their helicopters circling overhead, broadcasting the terrifying, confusing scene to a horrified nation. Inside the school, hundreds of students and teachers remained trapped, hiding in classrooms, closets, and kitchens. They barricaded doors with tables and chairs, huddled in darkness, and prayed for rescue. One of the most heroic stories to emerge was that of Dave Sanders, a teacher and coach. He had been in the cafeteria when the shooting began and had run through the hallways, warning students and herding them into classrooms to safety. In the process, he was shot by the gunman. He managed to crawl into a science classroom where students administered first aid, using shirts to try to stop the bleeding. They created a sign that they placed in the window: "One bleeding, two death." For over 3 hours, the students stayed with him, talking to him, showing him pictures of his children, trying to keep him alive. At 12:08 p.m., nearly 40 minutes after they had left the library, Harris and Klebold made their final move. They returned to the library, which was still filled with the dead, the wounded, and those pretending to be dead. The scene was eerily quiet. They walked to the windows and engaged in one last, brief gunfight with the police outside. Then they moved to the south side of the library, near the bookshelves where they had killed several of their classmates. There, surrounded by the carnage they had created, they turned their guns on themselves. At approximately 12:08 p.m., Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold committed suicide. But the authorities outside didn't know this. The siege continued. It wasn't until nearly 1 p.m. that the first SWAT team finally entered the school. They began a slow, painstaking, room-by-room clearing of the massive building, a process that would take hours. They found scenes of terror and relief as they evacuated terrified students from their hiding places. They found Dave Sanders in the science room, still barely alive. Tragically, he would die before paramedics could reach him. He was the only teacher killed in the attack. At 2:38 p.m., one of the most iconic and dramatic moments of the day occurred. Patrick Ireland, the student who had been shot in the head in the library and had drifted in and out of consciousness for hours, managed to crawl to the second-story window. Dazed and partially paralyzed, He pushed himself out of the window, dangling precariously before falling into the waiting arms of two SWAT officers on the roof of an armored vehicle below. The image of his dramatic rescue was broadcast live around the world, a single, powerful symbol of survival amidst the horror. It wasn't until 3:22 p.m., more than 4 hours after the first shots were fired, that SWAT teams finally entered the library. They found the bodies of the 10 victims and the 2 gunmen. The Columbine High School massacre was finally over. It had left 12 students and 1 teacher dead, and 24 others wounded. The 2 killers were also dead. The question of what had happened was answered. The much more difficult question of why had just begun. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, as the nation reeled from the sheer horror of the images broadcast from Littleton, a frantic search for answers began. The story of Columbine became a national obsession, a cultural Rorschach test onto which everyone projected their own fears and anxieties about modern American life. The initial narratives that emerged were simple, powerful, and, in many cases, profoundly wrong. The most pervasive of these was the story of the trench coat mafia. The media seized upon this idea, painting a picture of a large, organized goth cult, a gang of outcasts who had orchestrated the attack as revenge against the popular jocks who had bullied them. This narrative was compelling, but it was a distortion of the truth. While Harris and Klebold were on the periphery of this small group of friends who wore trench coats, they were not central members, and the group itself was not a violent gang. It was simply a collection of kids who felt like they didn't fit in. The idea that the massacre was a direct retaliation for bullying also proved to be an oversimplification. While the 2 killers certainly harbored resentment towards the school's jock culture, their private writings revealed a far deeper, more nihilistic, and less specific rage. They hated everyone. Jocks, preps, teachers, minorities, and humanity in general. Theirs was not a targeted revenge. It was a scorched earth assault on the world. The narrative of Cassie Bernal's martyrdom, the story of the girl who said yes when asked if she believed in God, also became a powerful, and ultimately inaccurate, touchstone. It spawned a best-selling book, She Said Yes, and became a rallying cry for Christian youth groups across the country. The story offered a comforting sense of meaning in a meaningless act of violence, but the evidence, confirmed by the 911 tape and the testimony of survivor Emily Wyant, indicates that the exchange never happened to Bernal. This disconnect between the public myth and the private reality highlighted the desperate need to find heroism and purpose in the face of incomprehensible horror. As the initial myths were slowly debunked, the investigation began to piece together a more complex and disturbing picture, largely through the discovery of the killer's journals and the basement tapes. These materials revealed the attack was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a meticulously planned act of domestic terrorism. The discovery of the unexploded propane bombs in the cafeteria shifted the entire understanding of the event. This was not just a school shooting. It was a failed bombing of catastrophic proportions. Had those bombs detonated as planned, the death toll would have been in the hundreds, dwarfing the Oklahoma City bombing and making Columbine the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil up to that point. The legacy of Columbine is deep and multifaceted, forever changing the landscape of American society. Its most immediate and tangible impact was on law enforcement protocol. The standard procedure of contain and wait was exposed as a catastrophic failure in an active shooter scenario. In its place, police departments across the country adopted a new, far more aggressive doctrine known as active shooter intervention. The new protocol dictates that the first officers on the scene, even if they are just patrol officers, are to form a small team and immediately enter the building to confront and neutralize the threat. The primary objective is no longer to contain but to stop the killing. This fundamental shift in police tactics has undoubtedly saved lives in the many school shootings that have tragically followed in Columbine's wake. The massacre also ushered in a new era of school security. The open, welcoming campuses of the past gave way to fortresses of locked doors, metal detectors, security cameras, and mandatory ID badges. Active shooter drills, once unthinkable, became a routine and terrifying part of the American school experience, traumatizing a generation of children who were taught to hide under their desks and prepare for the unthinkable. Columbine became a dark and powerful cultural symbol, a blueprint for future generations of troubled, alienated young men. The names and images of Harris and Klebold became iconic in the dark corners of the internet, their journals and manifestos studied and emulated by a subculture of Columbiners, who see them as misunderstood heroes and martyrs. The trench coat, the music, the date of April 20th, all became part of a grim, ready-made script for expressing homicidal rage. The attack created a deadly form of social contagion, a phenomenon that criminologists refer to as the Columbine effect, which has inspired dozens of copycat plots and attacks around the world. For the survivors, the families of the victims, and the community of Littleton, the aftermath was a long and painful journey of grief and recovery. They were forced to navigate not only their personal trauma but also the relentless glare of the media and the bizarre, often cruel, world of conspiracy theories that sprung up around the event. The library, the site of so much horror, was demolished and replaced with a new, sunlit atrium. A quiet, contemplative memorial was built on a hill near the school, a place of remembrance for the 13 lives that were lost. The Columbine High School massacre stands as a watershed moment in American history. It was the tragedy that fully woke the nation up to the horrifying possibility of mass violence in its schools, a problem that has tragically become an epidemic in the years since. It was a story that exposed the dark intersection of mental illness, social alienation, the availability of weapons, and the powerful allure of violent media. It tore down the comforting illusion of suburban safety and left in its place a host of difficult, unanswered questions about our culture, our children, and the nature of evil. The names of the 13 innocent people who died that day are a permanent, sorrowful reminder of the day that the heart of a quiet American town was broken, and the age of the school shooting began.